Hey there, tonight we're diving into the gritty reality of Victorian factories, where the truth is far harsher than any soot-stained novel might suggest. What you're about to discover will make you grateful for your cozy bed. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your day begins with the kind of alarm clock that doesn't need a snooze button, the relentless clang of machinery echoing through the soot-stained streets. Welcome to the Victorian factory grind, where the sun barely peeks over the horizon, but your workday is already revving up like an industrial steam engine. It's 5 a.m., and whether you're ready or not, it's time to dive into the daily grind that makes a 9-to-5 job sound like a luxury spa day. As you shuffle through the dimly lit streets, the air is thick with the smell of coal and sweat, your constant companions. The factory looms ahead, a hulking beast of brick and iron, where you'll be spending the next 14 hours. That's right, 14 hours. Forget about work-life balance. Here, it's more like work-life obliteration. Inside, the factory is a cacophony of noise and movement. The machines, like massive mechanical beasts, are already in full swing, and you're just a cog in this enormous, unforgiving contraption. The conditions are as harsh as your boss's glare if you're late, and believe me, punctuality isn't just a virtue here, it's a necessity. The pay, well, let's just say it wouldn't buy you a decent cup of coffee today. You're looking at about 10 shillings a week, which barely keeps the wolf from the door. To put that in perspective, a loaf of bread costs around 6pence. So your wages are essentially a tightrope walk between starvation and survival. And don't even think about saving for a rainy day. Every day feels like a torrential downpour when you're a Victorian factory worker. Now, if you're thinking this job is all about the adults, think again. Child labor is the name of the game, and kids as young as 5 are thrown into the mix, tasked with crawling under dangerous machinery or delivering messages through the labyrinth of the factory floor. It's a grim reality where childhood is more of a myth than a memory. The fact that children are working alongside you, their small hands and nimble fingers prized for tasks too delicate for the adult workforce, paints a stark picture of the era's priorities. It's not just about survival, it's about exploitation with a capital E. This is the world Charles Dickens wrote about, where the innocence of childhood is overshadowed by the shadow of industry. But amidst this bleak landscape, whispers of change are in the air. The seeds of the labor movement are being sown as workers begin to question the fairness of their lot. It's the early rumblings of a revolution that will eventually lead to shorter work weeks, better wages, and dare we say, weekends. Yes, the idea of having 2 whole days off would have been as foreign to a Victorian worker as Wi-Fi is to a caveman. As you toil away, you can't help but notice the camaraderie among the workers. There's a shared understanding, a bond forged in the fires of adversity. It's this solidarity that fuels the fledgling labor unions, groups that are starting to form in the shadows, plotting for better conditions and the radical notion that workers deserve dignity. So as the sun sets and the factory finally exhales its last breath of the day, you're left with a sense of exhaustion and perhaps a glimmer of hope. The day has been long, the work brutal and the pay meager. But amid the clang of machinery and the dust-laden air, there's the budding belief that things can and will change. And as you trudge home, with the evening sky casting a dull glow over the factory silhouette, you realize that surviving this day has been more than a test of endurance. It's been a testament to the human spirit's resilience. Tomorrow, the factory will call you back with its siren song of steam and steel. But tonight, you rest knowing that the fight for a better day has only just begun. As you finally drag yourself onto the factory floor, shaking off the remnants of sleep from the night before, the first thing that hits you, besides the overwhelming din, is the sheer grime of it all. It's like stepping into a different world, one where dirt and dust have joined forces to create a layer of filth so thick you could probably cut it with a knife. But hey, who has time for cleanliness when there are quotas to meet and machines to feed? Speaking of machines, let's talk about these industrial behemoths. Picture something that looks like it belongs in a steampunk fever dream, only more terrifying. These iron giants are the heart of the factory, thundering away with a rhythm that would make even the most hardcore drummer blush. But unlike your friendly neighborhood drummer, these machines have a nasty habit of taking more than just a beat. Fingers, limbs, sometimes entire lives. Machines weren't exactly known for their subtlety or safety. Into the 1833 Factory Act, the Victorian government's first tentative dip into the murky waters of workplace regulation. Now, don't get too excited. The act was about as effective as bringing an umbrella to a hurricane. Sure, it theoretically limited working hours for children to a measly 12 hours a day, and dictated that those under 9 couldn't work at all. But enforcement was another story. With only 4 inspectors to cover the entire country, it was a bit like trying to cover a football field with a single band-aid. The reality: children were still crawling under machinery, and adults were still working bone-crushing hours. This legislation was more headline than help, offering a faint promise of change without delivering much in the way of actual improvement. It's the classic, we're doing something move, without really doing all that much at all. But let's not forget the accidents. Ah, yes, the accidents. If you thought your morning commute was rough, try navigating a factory floor where safety first is more of an ironic joke than a policy. Statistics from the era are as grim as you'd expect. Thousands of injuries each year, with fingers and limbs lost to the relentless grind of machinery. An average of 300,000 workers a year were injured so severely they couldn't return to work immediately. And those are just the reported cases. Many more undoubtedly went unrecorded, swallowed by the factory's insatiable appetite. Let's not romanticize it. Victorian factories were death traps wrapped in brick and iron. The air was so thick with pollutants that simply breathing was a workout. The machinery, while marvels of industrial progress, were also monstrous contraptions that seemed to have a mind of their own, more interested in consuming workers than cotton. And the workers, they were expendable. If you lost a finger, you were out of luck. If you lost your life, well, there was always someone else ready to take your place. And while we're on the subject of expendability, let's talk about the wages. That 10 shillings a week we mentioned earlier, it wasn't just low, it was laughable, especially when you consider that the cost of living was anything but cheap. Bread and coal were constants on the grocery list, and unless you had a side hustle in alchemy, making ends meet was nearly impossible. The money you earned was often spent before you even had a chance to hold it in your hand, a never-ending cycle of earn, spend, survive. In this world, life was cheap, and the factory owner's bottom line was sacred. It's no wonder that the seeds of revolution were being sown. The unions, those fledgling bastions of worker rights, were starting to stir, but they were up against a Goliath. The establishment wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of giving workers rights, pay raises, or, heaven forbid, a weekend. But the rumblings were there, a low growl in the belly of the industrial beast, and it was only a matter of time before it erupted. So here you are, amidst the chaos, the dirt, and the clamour, scraping through another day in the factory. The work is grueling, the hours are endless, and the pay is laughable. Yet in the strange alchemy of human resilience, there's camaraderie here, a shared struggle that binds you to your fellow workers. You won't last a day, they said, but look at you, still standing, still fighting, even as the machines roar and the factory walls close in. The morning is slipping away, and the factory floor is a living organism, pulsing with the sweat and toil of workers. It's a world unto itself, a microcosm of Victorian society where the stark realities of industrialization play out every day. And yet, amid the clang and clamour, there's a hint of change in the air, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, things can be different. Don't get too comfortable, though. This is just the start of your day, and as the machinery churns and the hours tick by, you'll find that the Victorian factory grind is far from over. There's more to uncover, more to endure, and more to fight for as you navigate the labyrinth of steam and steel. So take a deep breath, if you can, and brace yourself for what's to come. The factory floor is a harsh mistress, and she's not done with you yet. As the morning's relentless grind drags on, a whistle finally pierces the air, signaling what passes for a lunch break. If you were expecting gourmet sandwiches and a cozy break room, think again. In the Victorian factory, lunch is more of a brief ceasefire in the battle against hunger and exhaustion. You and your fellow workers shuffle to a designated corner, still swathed in the shadows cast by the hulking machines, clutching whatever scraps you managed to bring from home. The social dynamics here are as tangled as the machinery itself. Forget the idyllic notion of workers arm in arm, singing songs of solidarity. This is a world where camaraderie must constantly jostle with competition. You see, with wages as meagre as they are, 10 shillings a week if you're lucky, everyone is vying for the crumbs of opportunity. It's a dog-eat-dog world, except the dogs are malnourished, and the stakes are life and death. Class divides are stark and unyielding, mirroring the chasm between the factory owner's plush office and the grimy factory floor. The foreman struts around, his position precariously perched between the workers, ire, and the owner's demands. He's got just enough authority to make your life miserable, but not enough to change his own fate. Above him, the factory owner lives in another world entirely, one of comfort and privilege, likely unaware of, or indifferent to, the soot-stained struggles of the masses beneath him. Among your fellow workers, you can see the nascent seeds of worker collectives beginning to sprout. These are the early roots of trade unions, the precursor to the organized labor movements that will eventually reshape the landscape of work. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right now, it's more whisper networks and covert gatherings than mass protests and picket lines. The workers dream of change, but the fear of retaliation is ever present, a spectre looming as large as the factory itself. And speaking of spectres, let's dive into the often overlooked role of women in these factories. Women make up a significant portion of the workforce, often relegated to roles deemed too menial or delicate for their male counterparts. Their pay, a mere fraction of what the men earn, despite the fact that their contributions are just as crucial. They stitch, spin, and assemble with dexterity and speed, yet they remain largely invisible in the historical narrative. It's the classic case of being essential yet unacknowledged, the invisible engine driving the machine that is industrial progress. The harsh reality is that these women are often juggling dual roles, factory worker by day, household manager by night. They shoulder the burden of domestic duties after a grueling day on the factory floor. It's a relentless cycle, where the lines between home and work blur into a single exhausting existence. The notion of having it all is as laughable now as it would have been then. Survival is the name of the game, and any dreams of fulfillment are often shelved in favor of putting food on the table. As you sit among your fellow workers, gnawing on a piece of stale bread, the air buzzes with quiet conversations. Topics range from the latest mishap on the factory floor, spoiler, someone lost a finger again, to hushed discussions about the union meetings happening in secret. There's a palpable tension here, an unspoken understanding that something's got to give, but no one's quite sure when or how that change will come. Despite the grim surroundings, there's a certain resilience in the air, a stubborn refusal to be completely beaten down by the system. It's this spirit that fuels the workers' camaraderie, a bond forged not out of choice, but necessity. Yes, there's competition, but there's also solidarity, a shared understanding that they're all in this together, for better or worse. In these brief moments of respite, you can almost see the outlines of a brighter future, a time when workers might have rights, fair wages, even weekends. But then the whistle blows again, snapping you back to the harsh reality of the present. The machines roar back to life, and the factory's relentless rhythm resumes, dragging you back into its unforgiving embrace. So you return to your post, the weight of the day pressing down like the factory's ever-present soot. As the afternoon wears on, you can't help but wonder how much longer things can continue this way. The whispers of discontent are growing louder, and change, though distant, seems inevitable. But for now, the work continues, unyielding and relentless, as the factory grinds on, consuming time and lives with equal indifference. And as you pick up your tools, ready to face the rest of the day, you're reminded that this is just one chapter in a story that's far from over. The Victorian factory may be a harsh teacher, but it's also a testament to human endurance, a place where the seeds of change are being sown, one grueling day at a time. There's much more to unravel in this tale of steam and steel, but for now, it's back to the grindstone as the factory's heart beats on. As the afternoon sun attempts to break through the smog-choked sky, the factory floor is as relentless as ever, a symphony of clanging metal and human fatigue. Welcome back to your Victorian day job, where the only thing moving faster than the machines is your dwindling energy. Now, let's dive into the economic backdrop of this industrial whirlwind. You're smack in the middle of the 19th century, a time when Britain was busy inventing capitalism as we know it. The Industrial Revolution, a phrase that evokes images of progress and prosperity, right. But here's the kicker. It wasn't all roses and riches, especially if you were glued to a factory floor. The economy was booming, all right. By 1850, Britain was cranking out 2/3 of the world's coal and half of its iron and cotton cloth. The country was like the Amazon, calm of its day minus the 2-day shipping. Yet, despite this economic juggernaut, the trickle-down effect was as effective as a broken umbrella in a monsoon. Workers were left staring at the financial feast from the wrong side of the window. Let's talk numbers. In 1867, the average annual income for a factory worker was around £30 to £35. Sounds decent. Hold your horses. That's roughly £3,000 in today's money. Meanwhile, a loaf of bread cost about a penny, which means your hardened wages were just a step above subsistence. And if you were hoping for a little meat to go with that bread, dream on. A pound of beef would set you back 9p. Luxury was a word not found in your vocabulary. Now, let's address the myth of the Luddites. Ah, the Luddites, a name that evokes images of a mob smashing machinery, right. But before you jump to conclusions, let's set the record straight. The Luddites weren't just mindless destroyers. They were skilled workers, terrified of losing their livelihoods to newfangled machines. You see, as technology advanced, people were understandably worried their jobs would vanish faster than a bonus check in December. The fear wasn't unfounded. By the 1810s, mechanization was changing the textile industry, allowing factories to produce goods faster and cheaper than ever. The Luddites didn't hate machines per se. They hated what the machines represented. Job loss and wage cuts. They were the original "don't take my job, bro" movement, challenging the notion that progress should come at the expense of human dignity. This anxiety was pervasive. The machines were not just tools. They were threats, symbols of a world where human labor could be replaced by cold, unfeeling metal. It's not surprising that by 1812, the Luddite protests had crescendoed to a point where the British government made machine breaking a capital offence. Talk about overkill. But here's the twist. While the Luddites were eventually quashed, their spirit lingered. Their struggle laid the groundwork for future labour movements. Enter the trade unions, the plucky underdogs in this industrial epic. These organisations were the workers' knights in greasy armour, advocating for better wages, safer conditions, and shorter hours. By the late 1800s, unions had gained enough traction to influence legislation, eventually leading to reforms like the 10-hour workday. However, the path to improvement was paved with resistance. The political climate was as volatile as a factory boiler ready to blow. The establishment wasn't thrilled about ceding power to the proletariat. After all, why fix something that wasn't broken for them? But the workers were persistent, their collective voice growing louder with each passing day. The unions were more than just a response to oppression. They were a testament to human grit. They represented hope, a flicker of light in the smog-darkened skies of industrial cities. And while the journey was fraught with setbacks, the workers' resolve was unwavering, their eyes set on a horizon where dignity and fairness were not just pipe dreams. As the afternoon drudgery drags on, you're reminded that these economic and political struggles weren't just abstract concepts. They were lived realities. Each clang of the factory hammer echoed not just the rhythm of industry, but the heartbeat of a society in flux. The workers, through their toil and tenacity, were slowly but surely reshaping their world. So, as you toil through the afternoon, with sweat and grime your constant companions, remember that you're part of a grand saga. A story where the underdogs are slowly staking their claim, carving out a space for themselves in a landscape dominated by titans of industry. The machines may roar, and the economic tides may seem insurmountable, but the human spirit is a stubborn beast, refusing to be subdued. And with that, the day grinds on, each tick of the clock a reminder that change is afoot. The Victorian factory isn't just a place of toil. It's a crucible, forging the future one relentless hour at a time. So take a deep breath, square your shoulders, and keep pushing forward. The story's not over yet, and the next chapter promises to be just as riveting as the last. As the factory's mechanical heart ticks toward the end of the day, let's pause and take a long, hard look at the toll this relentless grind takes on the human body, a body that's expected to function like the very machines it serves. Welcome to the Victorian era's unintended fitness program, where the only gains are respiratory issues and stunted growth. First things first, breathing. Inhaling the factory's air is like sucking on an exhaust pipe. The average worker inhales more than dust and dreams. It's coal dust, cotton fibers, and enough pollutants to make your lungs cry out for mercy. Chronic bronchitis and asthma become your not-so-friendly companions, tagging along as you shuffle through life. Tuberculosis is another uninvited guest, lurking around the corner like a stealthy pickpocket. In fact, 1 in every 4 deaths in the industrial cities is attributed to TB. It's not just a cough. It's the Grim Reaper's calling card. Now, let's talk about the kids. The joys of childhood, except in the Victorian factory, where innocence is traded for a few shillings and a lifetime of ailments. Children, often as young as 5, are thrust into this mechanical maw, their growth quite literally stunted by the weight of labor that should never rest on such small shoulders. Malnutrition is rampant, and the combination of long hours and scant meals means these kids often stop growing altogether, like a plant left in the dark. The work environment doesn't just stunt growth. It shapes a generation of workers whose bodies are a testament to the era's brutal expectations. Bent spines, twisted limbs, and the telltale cough of respiratory illness become badges of survival. These are not just scars of labor, they're historical markers, chronicling the human cost of industrial progress. But wait, there's a silver lining. Eventually, the struggle for better conditions wasn't just idle chatter over stale bread. It was a battle cry that slowly, agonizingly, began to be heard. Enter the factory acts, those incremental steps towards sanity. By the late 19th century, new laws started to nibble away at the beastly work conditions. The Factory Act of 1878 finally set a maximum of 56 hours a week for children, a marked improvement, even if it still sounds like a modern-day horror story. These reforms were the slow burn of revolution, igniting the spark for a future where the factory floor wouldn't be a death sentence. The labor movement began to gather steam, no pun intended, and by the 20th century, the groundwork was laid for labor rights as we know them. Weekends, minimum wages, and workplace safety regulations became the new gospel, preached from the pulpits of union halls and legislative chambers. So here we are, standing on the shoulders of those who toiled and fought in the factories of yore. We've traded the soot-stained walls for cubicles and open-plan offices, but let's not kid ourselves. There's still a long way to go. The echoes of the past remind us that progress is never a straight line. It's a jagged climb, full of setbacks and triumphs, much like the lives of those Victorian workers. As the factory doors creak open and you stagger out, exhausted but alive, remember this. The story isn't just about the past. It's a cautionary tale for the present. We've come far, sure, but complacency is the enemy of progress. Whether it's fighting for fair wages or advocating for mental health days, the spirit of those early laborers lives on in every demand for dignity in the workplace. So take a moment to breathe, preferably clean air, and appreciate the journey from then to now. The Victorian factory, with its grime and grind, was more than a place of toil. It was a crucible of change, shaping the world we navigate today. And as you walk away, with the evening air finally fresh in your lungs, remember that the fight for a fairer world is far from over. It rolls on, fueled by the lessons of history and the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. Welcome to the future, where the past is always present, urging us ever forward. In the land where ziggurats pierced the sky like ancient skyscrapers, Mesopotamia was the OG hub of innovation, a hotbed of ideas that shaped the world long before Da Vinci ever doodled his first helicopter. Nestled snugly between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this patch of desert was a fertile crescent of human achievement, where the earliest city slickers strutted their stuff in Sumerian sandals. And right in the heart of it all was Uruk, the city that birthed legends and boasted a king who'd make even modern influencers blush with envy. Welcome to Uruk, the historical stage where Gilgamesh, a king with a god complex and a talent for making questionable decisions, would carve his name into the annals of myth and history. This was a place where the line between deities and humans blurred, and where a two-thirds divine being could rule with an iron fist, or at least a very persuasive Twitter thread, if he had one. With a population that could rival a bustling modern city, Uruk was the New York City of 3000 BC, complete with its own version of Wall Street. The temple complex, where the economic heart of the city beat as steadily as the Euphrates River flowed. The Sumerians, those brainy residents of Mesopotamia, weren't just sitting around watching the reeds grow. They were busy inventing stuff, serious game changers like writing and the wheel, which are arguably two of the most underrated inventions ever. I mean, can you imagine a world without wheels? It's like trying to imagine pizza without cheese. It just doesn't work. This was the era that saw the birth of cuneiform, the first written language, which made it possible for bureaucrats to gripe about taxes in a permanent medium. And let's not forget beer, because yes, the Sumerians invented that too, around 3400 BC. Thanks to them, people could drown their sorrows in a nice, frothy ale while lamenting the latest tax hike or Gilgamesh's newest decree. Now, speaking of Gilgamesh, let's get to the man of the hour, or millennium really. He was part god, part human, and all sorts of complicated. Imagine a king who was two-thirds divine, which sounds like one of those fractions you'd struggle to wrap your head around in math class. But that was Gilgamesh for you, a ruler who would have had a field day with social media, mixing divine wisdom with all too human flaws in a way that would make for some truly epic tweets. He ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE, a time when kings were closer to demigods than elected officials. And like all good demigods, he was loaded with charisma, strength, and a penchant for pushing his people to the brink. Uruk under Gilgamesh was a place of grand constructions and restless citizens, a city that thrived and groaned under his larger-than-life presence. He was the kind of king who could build a wall that would make the Great Wall of China look like a backyard fence. Yet he'd also be the guy who'd rewrite the rules of divine etiquette just because he could. But here's the twist. The epic tale of Gilgamesh, with all its gods, monsters, and quests for immortality, wasn't just about glorifying a king. It was also a reflection of the Sumerian world, a place where the divine mingled with the mundane, where the quest for eternal life was as much a literary motif as it was a philosophical inquiry. The Sumerians weren't just crafting stories. They were delving into the very essence of what it means to be human, a theme that resonates with us even thousands of years later. Gilgamesh's adventures, pennied down in Akkadian cuneiform, were like the ancient world's version of a blockbuster saga. Picture an epic filled with friendship, betrayal, gods behaving badly, and a quest that would rival anything Hollywood could dream up. And at its core, it was a tale of humility and humanity, of a king learning that even divine blood can't shield one from the ultimate equalizer, mortality. So, as we set the stage for this legendary tale, Remember that the world of Gilgamesh was one where the lines between fact and fiction danced like shadows on a ziggurat, a place where innovation and myth walked hand in hand, crafting a narrative that would endure the sands of time, much like the bricks of Uruk's mighty walls. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the epic, where gods, monsters, and a king with a penchant for existential crises await. As the dust settles on the mighty walls of Uruk, our attention turns to a tale of friendship that would make even the most heartwarming Hollywood buddy flick take a backseat. Enter Enkidu, the wild man crafted by the gods themselves to be Gilgamesh's perfect foil. Picture Tarzan with a Mesopotamian twist, and you've got a pretty good image of Enkidu, minus the vine-swinging and talking animals. This guy was all about chilling with gazelles and drinking straight from the river. He was the yin to Gilgamesh's yang, designed to bring balance to a king who was in dire need of a reality check. The gods, ever the meddling matchmakers, decided that a bromance of epic proportions was just what Uruk needed. You see, Gilgamesh's power had gone to his head, a common issue among those with divinity in their DNA. He was 2/3 god, 1/3 human, which, if you ask me, sounds like a recipe for a divine identity crisis. And so, Enkidu was sent to humble him, not with a celestial smackdown, but with friendship. It's like the gods invented the ultimate friendship app, and Enkidu was the perfect match. Their meeting was the ancient equivalent of an action-packed meet-cute. Enkidu, after being civilized by spending a week with a temple prostitute named Shamhat, which, by the way, is an ancient plot twist that would likely need some serious updating for a modern audience, rolls into Uruk to challenge Gilgamesh's tyranny. The two men meet like rival alphas, clashing with the ferocity of lions, only to find that their strengths perfectly complement each other. It's the kind of chemistry that would make casting directors swoon. Now, let's talk about the cedar forest, an ancient expanse that would have been the pride of any kingdom. This wasn't just any old forest. It was the domain of Humbaba, a fearsome guardian appointed by the god Enlil. Think of Humbaba as the original bouncer, with a face that could launch 1,000 nightmares. Gilgamesh and Enkidu's decision to tackle this forest and its monstrous keeper was as much about fame and glory as it was about logging rights. Those cedar trees were the Mesopotamian equivalent of prime real estate, a valuable resource for building temples and palaces. Their journey to the cedar forest was like a road trip with existential stakes. It was a test of strength, courage, and the bonds of friendship. In modern terms, it was less The Hangover and more Lord of the Rings, with a dash of moral quandary thrown in for good measure. Together, they faced Humbaba in a battle that was as much about proving their worth as it was about defying the will of the gods. The Sumerians held a complex view of nature. They revered and feared it in equal measure, seeing the divine in the natural world while also understanding its potential for chaos. So when Gilgamesh and Enkidu took on Humbaba, they weren't just conquering a forest, they were challenging the very order of the universe. It was an audacious move that echoed the Sumerians' own struggles with the unpredictable elements of life in the Fertile Crescent, where floods and droughts could turn prosperity into despair overnight. But let's not gloss over the romanticism of this story. Sure, it reads like a buddy cop movie script, bad boys, with a side of divine intervention, but it's also a reflection of the human quest for meaning. Through their adventures, Gilgamesh and Enkidu explored the boundaries of friendship, mortality, and the eternal search for glory. They were the archetypal heroes, setting the bar for all bromances to come. This tale resonates even today, proving that whether you're a king or a commoner, finding your tribe is a universal quest. It's a reminder that amidst the chaos of gods and monsters, it's the bonds we form with others that define our journey. The bromance of Gilgamesh and Enkidu wasn't just a story. It was an epic narrative that captured the essence of the human condition, flawed, complex, and beautifully intertwined with the lives of those we choose to stand beside. As we leave Gilgamesh and Enkidu at the edge of the cedar forest, poised to confront both destiny and a very cranky forest guardian, remember that this is just the beginning of their saga. Stay tuned for more tales of heroism and hubris, where gods, mortality, and the eternal quest for meaning weave together in a tapestry as intricate as cuneiform on clay. And so we find ourselves standing at the edge of the cedar forest, with Gilgamesh and Enkidu ready to face destiny, and a very irritated Humbaba. Now, if you think this encounter was just another day in the Mesopotamian office, think again. This wasn't just a skirmish with a mythical beast. It was a brazen slap in the face of the gods, and they would not be hitting the like button on this escapade. Picture this. The gods, perched on their celestial sofas, watching the scene unfold like a divine reality show. Enlil, the god who appointed Humbaba as the forest's bouncer, was less than amused. The cedar forest was sacred ground, a heavenly VIP section, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu crashing the party was the ultimate act of hubris. But hey, if anyone could pull off this cosmic gate crashing, it was our dynamic duo. The battle was nothing short of epic. Think WWE meets Game of Thrones. After a hard-fought struggle, they decapitated Humbaba, claiming his head as a trophy. But here's the kicker. This victory came with a serious cosmic hangover. Enlil was furious, and he wasn't the forgiving type. This act of defiance was like sticking your hand in a hornet's nest and hoping for a honey reward. And so the gods, in their infinite wisdom, decided that someone had to pay the price for this transgression. Spoiler alert, it wasn't going to be Gilgamesh. Nope, Enkidu drew the short straw in this divine lottery. Cue the tears, folks, because this is where our bromantic tale takes a tragic turn. Enkidu was struck down by disease, a slow, agonizing demise that left Gilgamesh reeling. It was as if the universe had decided to teach a masterclass in humility and mortality, with Enkidu as the unwilling poster child. Here's where the plot thickens like a good Mesopotamian stew. Enkidu's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for Gilgamesh. It was a seismic shockwave that rattled the foundations of his worldview. For the first time, the mighty king was confronted with the cold, hard fact that even demigods aren't immune to the grim reaper's call. This was no mere existential hiccup. It was a full-blown crisis. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as inscribed on those clay tablets, was as much a philosophical treatise as it was a blockbuster adventure. Mortality was a theme that resonated deeply with the ancient Mesopotamians, who lived in a world where life was a precarious balancing act between prosperity and catastrophe. Floods, famines, and feuding gods made the quest for immortality more than just a mythic motif. It was a reflection of the human condition, universal and timeless. Now, let's pause for a moment to appreciate the irony here. Gilgamesh, the guy who could rival Hercules in the demigod department, was suddenly questioning his place in the cosmos. His reaction to Enkidu's death was like watching a superhero grapple with a midlife crisis. He set off on a journey to find the secret of eternal life, a quest that would take him to the ends of the earth and back again, literally. But before we get to that pilgrimage, let's consider the economic and social context. In a world where the average life expectancy was about 30, give or take a plague or two, the idea of living forever was an alluring concept. The Sumerians etched their dreams and fears into cuneiform on clay tablets, creating a legacy that outlived them by millennia. Their fascination with life, death, and the afterlife was as much about grappling with their own mortality as it was about leaving a mark on history. Gilgamesh's quest was, in essence, a reflection of this societal obsession. The king who had everything, power, prestige, a killer Instagram-worthy wall, was suddenly stripped bare by the loss of his friend. It was a poignant reminder that no amount of divine lineage could protect him from the human condition. The tablets tell us that Gilgamesh wandered the wilderness, donning animal skins and shunning civilization, in search of answers that lay just beyond his grasp. This journey was as much an inward exploration as it was an outward adventure. The epic describes encounters with mystical creatures and wise old immortals, each offering a piece of the puzzle. But the most striking aspect of this odyssey was its portrayal of a hero who, for all his divinity, was achingly human. Gilgamesh's existential musings could rival those of any modern philosopher grappling with the meaning of life over a cup of artisanal coffee. And let's not forget the primary sources. the clay tablets themselves. These ancient texts offer a tantalizing glimpse into the minds of a civilization wrestling with the same questions that haunt us today. The inscriptions are a testament to the enduring power of storytelling, a medium through which the Sumerians could explore the mysteries of existence. They remind us that, despite the passage of time and the rise and fall of empires, the fundamental questions of life remain unchanged. So as Gilgamesh trudged onward, driven by his existential angst and the memory of Enkidu, the epic continued to weave its tapestry of myth and meaning. The king's quest was a journey without a map, a search for the unattainable that resonated with the human heart's deepest longings. It was a narrative that, in its own way, encapsulated the essence of the Sumerian spirit, a people who dared to dream, even as they faced the harsh realities of life in the cradle of civilization. As we leave Gilgamesh on his epic quest for immortality, remember that this is just one chapter in a story that continues to captivate and inspire. The ancient echoes of Uruk still resonate in our modern world, a reminder that the search for meaning is a journey we all undertake, whether we're kings or mere mortals. Stay tuned for the next installment, where more adventures, revelations, and existential dilemmas await our intrepid hero. So, as Gilgamesh trudged onward, driven by his existential angst and the memory of Enkidu, we find our hero in a state of spiritual upheaval more intense than a teenager's first existential crisis. His quest for immortality was like trying to hold onto a New Year's resolution past February, ambitious, but doomed by the harsh realities of life. Gilgamesh was determined to find Utnapishtim, the legendary immortal who, unlike most of us, had actually managed to cheat death. Now, let's talk about Utnapishtim, a name that sounds like a sneeze but represents the Mesopotamian equivalent of Noah. This guy wasn't just any old wise man. He was the survivor of a cataclysmic flood that wiped out the world, or at least a sizable chunk of it. Before you roll your eyes and chalk it up to another flood myth, let's dive into the data pool. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Mesopotamian region experienced significant flooding events between 2900 and 2600 BCE, which could have inspired these watery tales. But back to Utnapishtim and his epic survival story. The gods, in a moment of divine whimsy, or perhaps just a celestial mood swing, decided to wipe out humanity with a flood of biblical proportions. Enter Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who had a soft spot for humanity and whispered the plan to Utnapishtim, effectively turning him into the first whistleblower. He was instructed to build a massive boat, gather his family and all living creatures, because what's a flood story without a menagerie? And ride out the deluge. Sound familiar? The flood story wasn't just an ancient cautionary tale. It was a reflection of the very real and frequent natural disasters that plagued the region. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were known for their unpredictable flooding, which could transform fertile fields into watery wastelands overnight. This wasn't just a mythological exaggeration. It was a lived experience for the Sumerians, who had to contend with the whims of a capricious environment. The flood narrative served as a reminder of nature's supremacy and humanity's precarious place within it, a theme that echoes through time, from ancient Mesopotamia to modern hurricane and tsunami warnings. So Gilgamesh, with his heart set on immortality, sought Utnapishtim, who was chilling at the edge of the world, probably enjoying his eternal retirement. The journey was fraught with challenges, including crossing the waters of death, a poetic name for what was essentially the ancient version of a no-swim zone. But perseverance was Gilgamesh's middle name, or it would have been if ancient Sumerians did middle names, and he eventually arrived at Utnapishtim's doorstep, ready to learn the secret of everlasting life. When Gilgamesh finally met Utnapishtim, he was hoping for a straightforward recipe for immortality, like a divine smoothie with a dash of eternal youth. Instead, he got a philosophical lecture about the nature of life and death, which probably felt like getting a self-help book when you really just wanted the Cliff's Notes. Utnapishtim explained that the gods had granted him immortality as a unique reward, not a repeatable formula. In other words, Gilgamesh was out of luck. But Utnapishtim, not one to leave a hero empty-handed or empty-headed, shared the story of the flood, a tale that might have sounded eerily familiar to anyone who's ever heard of a certain ark and a certain 40-day rainstorm. This wasn't just a bedtime story. It was an allegory for the unpredictability of life and the transient nature of existence. Utnapishdam's survival was a testament to resilience and adaptability, key traits for anyone hoping to make it through life's turbulent waters, whether literal or metaphorical. Now here's where the plot thickens like Mesopotamian mud after a flood. Utnapishdam offered Gilgamesh a consolation prize, the location of a magical plant that could restore youth. It was the ancient world's equivalent of an anti-aging serum, promising to turn back the clock without the need for Botox or kale smoothies. Naturally, Gilgamesh was all in, and with a renewed sense of purpose, he set out to find this botanical fountain of youth. In a turn of events that would make even Murphy's Law nod in approval, Gilgamesh found the plant, but, exhausted from his journey, decided to take a nap. As you might expect in a tale filled with cosmic irony, a snake slithered by and gobbled up the plant while he snoozed. Yes, a snake, the eternal symbol of temptation and loss, robbed Gilgamesh of his prize. This wasn't just a narrative twist, it was a metaphorical slap in the face, reminding our hero, and us, of life's fickle nature. Thus, Gilgamesh's quest for immortality ended not with a triumphant victory, but with a humbling lesson. He returned to Uruk, not as an immortal, but as a wiser king who had come to terms with his mortality. His journey, steeped in myth and muddied by reality, highlighted the universal struggle to find meaning in a world where permanence is an illusion. It was a narrative as old as time, resonating with anyone who's ever pondered their place in the universe while staring at the stars, or a particularly existential cup of coffee. The epic of Gilgamesh, with its blend of myth and history, offers a timeless reminder of the human condition. As we navigate our own quests, whether for glory, meaning, or a few extra years, we walk the same path as Gilgamesh, grappling with the eternal questions that have haunted humanity since the dawn of civilization. This ancient tale, inscribed on brittle clay tablets, continues to echo through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of storytelling and the relentless quest for understanding in a world as unpredictable as the Mesopotamian floods. And so, as we leave Gilgamesh standing on the mighty walls of Uruk, contemplating the city he helped build and the legacy he would leave behind, we find ourselves reflecting on our own journeys. The ancient echoes of his story remind us that while we may never find the secret to immortality, the pursuit of wisdom and the bonds we form along the way are the true treasures of life. Stay tuned for the next installment, where the epic tale continues to unravel, offering more lessons and legends from the cradle of civilization. As Gilgamesh stood atop Uruk's formidable walls, the realization washed over him like a Mesopotamian flash flood. No amount of divine lineage or heroic exploits could stave off the inevitable march of time. It was a moment of clarity that would make even a modern-day mindfulness guru proud. He wasn't just a king returning to his city. He was a man who had danced with gods, wrestled with existential dread, and come away with a profound understanding of what it truly meant to lead. Gilgamesh's homecoming was more than a physical return. It was the culmination of a journey that had stripped him of his illusions and left him with something far more precious: wisdom. This was a king who finally embraced his mortality, not as a curse, but as the defining characteristic of his humanity. In a world where pyramids rose to defy the heavens and pharaohs claimed godhood, Gilgamesh's acceptance of his limits was a revolutionary act of humility. Back in Uruk, the city hummed with life, its ziggurats standing proud against the horizon like ancient skyscrapers. The economic heart of the city pulsed with the rhythms of trade and commerce, as merchants bartered goods that would make even today's Wall Street brokers take note. The temple complex, Uruk's version of a bustling stock exchange, was where the city's wealth was both generated and measured. This wasn't just a city. It was a hub of innovation and enterprise, fueled by the Sumerians' insatiable curiosity and knack for invention. You see, Mesopotamian society wasn't just about building impressive monuments or weaving epic tales. It was a hotbed of economic activity that would shape the course of history. Agriculture thrived in the Fertile Crescent, thanks to the ingenious irrigation systems that made the arid landscape bloom like a desert mirage. These early engineers were the unsung heroes who turned water into prosperity, ensuring that the city's granaries were always full and its citizens well fed. But let's not get too lost in the romanticism of ancient innovation. The harsh reality was that life in Mesopotamia was a constant battle against the whims of nature and the capriciousness of the gods. Floods, droughts, and the occasional plague were as much a part of the landscape as the mighty Euphrates. It was a world where survival required not just ingenuity, but resilience, a trait that Gilgamesh embodied as he returned to his people. As a leader, Gilgamesh's newfound perspective transformed his approach to governance. He understood that true leadership wasn't about wielding power with an iron fist, but about leaving a legacy that would endure, much like the cuneiform tablets that chronicled his adventures. These tablets, etched with the stories of gods and heroes, were the ancient world's version of a bestseller list. They served as both a record of history and a guide for future generations, a reminder that storytelling was as vital as the air they breathed. Speaking of legacy, let's take a moment to consider the impact of Mesopotamian culture on the modern world. The Sumerians' contributions to civilization are like the secret ingredients in a recipe that most people take for granted. From the invention of writing to the creation of complex legal codes, their innovations laid the groundwork for everything from literature to law. Hammurabi's code, etched in stone for all to see, was a precursor to the legal systems that govern us today, proving that the pursuit of justice is as timeless as the stars in the sky. And then there's the matter of literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just a relic of a bygone era. It's a narrative that continues to resonate with anyone who's ever grappled with the big questions of life. Its themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning are as relevant now as they were thousands of years ago. This ancient tale, with its blend of myth and reality, serves as a reminder that storytelling is a powerful tool for exploring the human condition. Now, let's circle back to Gilgamesh's journey, because it's one that's surprisingly relatable even today. Sure, most of us aren't kings with divine ancestry, but who hasn't faced a crisis of identity or pondered the meaning of life while stuck in traffic? Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is a metaphor for the universal human desire to leave a mark, to be remembered long after we've shuffled off this mortal coil. It's a narrative that speaks to the heart of what it means to be human, flaws and all. As Gilgamesh looked out over his city, he saw not just the bricks and mortar of Uruk, but the vibrant tapestry of lives that made up its soul. His legacy would not be measured by the walls he built or the battles he won, but by the impact he had on the people he led. It was a lesson in leadership that transcended time, a reminder that true greatness is defined not by power, but by the ability to inspire and uplift others. So, as the sun set over the horizon, casting its golden glow over the ancient city, Gilgamesh stood as a testament to the enduring power of transformation. His journey, etched into tablets that would outlast empires, was a reminder that the pursuit of wisdom, compassion, and understanding is the true path to immortality. In embracing his mortal legacy, Gilgamesh found the ultimate victory, a life well lived, defined not by divine parentage, but by the choices he made and the lives he touched. And there you have it, folks, the epic tale of Gilgamesh, a king who learned that the greatest stories are those that echo through time, grounded in the realities of the human experience. As we wrap up this journey through the cradle of civilization, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons of leadership, legacy, and the unyielding quest for meaning. Because, in the end, isn't that what it's all about? Finding our place in the grand narrative of life and leaving the world just a little bit better than we found it. In the bustling chaos of ancient Athens, somewhere around 470 BCE, a peculiar child named Socrates was born. Now, if you were expecting him to spring into the world holding a scroll and spouting wisdom, you'd be sorely mistaken. His early years weren't exactly filled with philosophical debates. Nope, he was far more likely to be found with a chisel in hand, learning the family trade of stone masonry from his father, Sophroniscus. Talk about a literal rock-solid start to life. Socrates' family wasn't exactly rolling in drachmas, but they weren't destitute either. Think of them as the middle-class Athenians of their time. They had enough to get by, but there weren't any marble statues of little Socrates lining the Parthenon. His father chipped away at stones, while his mother, Phaenerete, a midwife, helped bring new life into the world. If you're wondering whether Socrates' future philosophical musings were somehow inspired by his mother's earthy profession, you're in good company. It's a theory that's been floated around, but who really knows? Maybe he just liked to talk. Despite the family's modest means, Socrates received the standard education of the day, which, for Athenian boys, meant learning the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But here's the kicker. Socrates wasn't particularly enthralled by the curriculum. Instead, he seemed more interested in the grand theatre of Athenian life itself. The agora, the marketplace, was his classroom, and the citizens of Athens were his unwitting teachers. He'd wander around, barefoot no less, engaging anyone willing or unwilling in conversation. The barefoot thing, not a fashion statement, just Socrates being Socrates. Practical, maybe, given Athens' mild climate, but it certainly set him apart in the crowd. The young Socrates was known to question everything. To put it mildly, he was a bit of a gadfly, constantly buzzing around, challenging the status quo. This trait, while endearing to us modern armchair philosophers, might not have been quite so charming to his contemporaries. Imagine trying to buy your daily olives only to have a scruffy young Socrates pop up, questioning the nature of commerce and the ethics of your purchase. For some, it was delightful. For others, downright annoying. This knack for questioning everything around him didn't magically appear one morning after Socrates had an epiphany over a cup of watered-down wine. It was a gradual development, likely influenced by the vibrant intellectual environment of Athens, a city very much alive with ideas. And while we're myth-busting, let's address the notion that Socrates was some kind of uneducated savant. Sure, he didn't have the polished education of a noble, but he wasn't some back-alley philosopher either. His informal education was rich and varied, shaped by the diverse influences of Athenian society. Now, let's talk about the myth of his humble beginnings. It's a romantic tale, right? The idea of a great thinker rising from obscurity to challenge the intellectual giants of his age. But the truth is, Socrates wasn't exactly a rags-to-riches story. His family, while not affluent, was well integrated into Athenian society. They mingled with enough important people that Socrates wasn't some unknown upstart. His early life wasn't a struggle against the odds, but more of a meandering journey filled with philosophical curiosity. And what did little Socrates think of all this? Probably not much. He was too busy being, well, Socrates. The early years of his life set the stage for what was to come. A life of relentless questioning, a refusal to accept easy answers, and the audacity to walk around without shoes. Socrates was Athens' own philosophical enfant terrible, and while he may not have known it yet, he was already beginning to carve out a legacy that would be debated for millennia. So, the next time you hear about Socrates, the great philosopher, remember that he started as a curious kid with dusty feet, keen on understanding the world around him, one perplexing question at a time. Socrates, with dusty feet and a curiosity that could put a cat to shame, was on the brink of something big. But it wasn't fame or fortune he was after. Oh no, that would be far too ordinary. His method, the Socratic method, was about as unconventional as, well, questioning the very fabric of reality while everyone else was just trying to get on with their day. Picture this. A marketplace buzzing with activity, and there's Socrates, engaging in what we now call a dialogue. But really, it was more of a relentless game of philosophical dodgeball. He'd start with a question, then follow up with another, and another, until his conversational partner was either enlightened or utterly bewildered. Some might say Socrates was the original overthinker, but let's be honest, he made it an art form. His disdain for tangible rewards is legendary or infamous, depending on whom you ask. While his contemporaries were busy stacking drachmas, Socrates was busy stacking questions. Wealth, nah. Prestige, pass. He lived in what we now call voluntary simplicity, which is a polite way of saying he didn't care much for money or material possessions. Athens was a city where wealth could buy you power and influence, but Socrates seemed to believe that true richness came from a well-examined life. And if that meant going without shoes, so be it. His indifference to material wealth was so profound that it became both his charm and his curse, attracting followers and detractors alike. Now let's get to the juicy part, his relationships with Athens' bigwigs. Socrates had connections, that's for sure. He rubbed shoulders with the who's who of Athens, including Alcibiades and Critias, both of whom had more drama in their lives than your average soap opera. Alcibiades, a charismatic yet controversial figure, was kind of the rock star of Athens, charismatic, ambitious, and a tad reckless. Socrates, perhaps seeing a spark of potential amidst the chaos, took him under his wing. Their relationship was complex, filled with mutual admiration and a fair share of philosophical sparring. Socrates had this knack for seeing potential where others saw only trouble, which is probably why he never shied away from the more tumultuous personalities. And then there was Critias, a man with a penchant for power plays that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. Critias later became one of the 30 tyrants, a fact that would haunt Socrates during his trial. Despite their differing paths, Socrates' influence on these men was undeniable. He had this uncanny ability to attract and challenge those with power, offering them a philosophical lens through which to view their actions. Whether they listened is another story entirely, but Socrates never stopped asking the hard questions, ones that often made the powerful a bit uncomfortable. Speaking of discomfort, let's talk military service. Yes, Socrates, the man who spent most of his days in philosophical contemplation, also served in the Athenian military. And he wasn't just there to fill out the ranks. He actually distinguished himself with acts of bravery. Take the Battle of Potidaea, for instance. Socrates reportedly saved the life of Alcibiades, carrying him to safety in the heat of battle. Sure, it's a tale with a touch of heroism, but it's also a testament to Socrates' complex character. He could be both a warrior and a philosopher, a man of action and thought, which is something his detractors would conveniently overlook later on. Yet, it's this very duality that makes Socrates such a fascinating figure. He could march into battle one day and engage in deep philosophical discourse the next. His courage on the battlefield was mirrored by his intellectual bravery, a willingness to question everything, even when it led to uncomfortable truths. And if you think about it, there's something downright modern about his refusal to fit neatly into society's boxes. He was a man out of time, questioning norms while others built them. This, of course, didn't always win him friends. In fact, his penchant for questioning often put him at odds with the very society he sought to engage. His detractors saw him as a nuisance, a man who poked holes in their carefully constructed worldviews. To them, he was less of a gadfly and more of a gadthorn. Yet, Socrates never wavered, continuing his quest for truth even as it led him into deeper waters. His philosophy wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life, one that required courage both on and off the battlefield. In this complex tapestry of relationships and philosophies, Socrates carved out a unique niche. He managed to be both revered and reviled, a friend to some and a foe to others. His life was a series of contradictions, yet it was precisely these contradictions that made him so compelling. He was a man who wore his philosophy like a second skin, unafraid to challenge anyone, no matter their status. And so we leave Socrates not as a man of answers, but as a man of questions, a relentless seeker of truth in a world that often preferred the comfort of easy answers. His journey was far from over, and the trials and tribulations that awaited would only serve to cement his legacy further. But for now, Socrates remained the unassuming philosopher of Athens, a man whose simple questions would echo through the ages, challenging us to think, to question, and to seek the truths hidden beneath the surface. As Socrates wandered through Athens with his signature blend of curiosity and impertinence, the city itself was a complex tapestry of power plays, philosophical debates, and a dash of democracy that was as chaotic as it was groundbreaking. Welcome to Athens circa 399 BCE, where political and social tensions simmered just below the surface like an Athenian stew ready to boil over. And at the heart of it all was our man Socrates, who seemed to have a knack for poking the bear, or in this case, the entire Athenian establishment. The political landscape in Athens at this time was a bit like a soap opera with more toga-clad actors and fewer commercial breaks. Picture a city-state trying to juggle the aftermath of a devastating war, the Peloponnesian War to be exact, which had ended in 404 BCE with Sparta giving Athens a metaphorical sucker punch. The Athenians were licking their wounds, grappling with the loss of their empire, and dealing with the 30 tyrants' brief but brutal oligarchic rule which followed the war. These tyrants led by Critias, yes, the same Critias who was once a student of Socrates, had been about as popular as a Spartan at an Athenian party, leaving a trail of bloodshed and bitterness in their wake. By the time of Socrates' trial, Athens was trying to pick up the pieces and restore its democratic glory days, but the scars left by the war and the tyranny were still raw. In this climate of suspicion and fear, it wasn't just the politicians who were under scrutiny. Intellectuals and philosophers, those pesky questioners of all things status quo, were also in the crosshairs. Enter Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, feared by some for his relentless questioning and adored by others for the same reason. His association with controversial figures like Critias and Alcibiades didn't exactly help his case, especially since their political antics had left a sour taste in the mouths of many Athenians. The charges against Socrates were twofold: impiety, or failing to recognize the gods of the city, and corrupting the youth. Now, the charge of impiety might seem a bit rich given that Athens was a city where gods seemed to outnumber people, but in reality, it was a serious accusation. Religion in Athens wasn't just a belief system. It was woven into the very fabric of the state. To question the gods, or worse, to introduce new ones, was akin to questioning the legitimacy of the state itself. And then there was the charge of corrupting the youth, which was as vague as it was damning. Essentially, Socrates was accused of filling the heads of Athenian youth with dangerous ideas, encouraging them to question authority and think for themselves. The horror, but let's take a step back and unpack these charges. The reality was that Socrates, with his relentless questioning, was seen as a destabilizing force in a city trying to regain its footing. His method of engaging with the youth of Athens, encouraging them to think critically and challenge conventional wisdom, was threatening to the establishment. The truth is, when you make a habit of questioning everything, you inevitably step on some powerful toes. And Socrates had stepped on more than his fair share. But the idea that he was some sort of evil mastermind, deliberately corrupting the youth, is as ludicrous as it sounds. It's like blaming a magnifying glass for starting a fire while conveniently ignoring the sun. Now, let's talk about the trial itself, which was less of a judicial proceeding and more of a theatrical spectacle. Imagine a courtroom drama where the defendant is more interested in probing philosophical truths than in defending himself against the charges. Socrates, in true Socratic style, used his trial as a platform to engage his accusers in a philosophical dialogue, questioning the very basis of the charges against him. It was as if he was playing chess while everyone else was busy playing checkers. And let's be honest, when your trial strategy involves questioning the intelligence of the jury, you're either incredibly brave or a little bit crazy. The jury, composed of 501 Athenian citizens, wasn't exactly a neutral body. In a city still reeling from political upheaval, many jurors were likely influenced by the turbulent recent history and the collective desire for stability. Socrates, never one to shy away from controversy, didn't do himself any favors with his unapologetic defense. He famously compared himself to a gadfly, a necessary irritant to the Athenian state. It's the kind of metaphor that sounds great in a philosophy class, but perhaps less so when your freedom is on the line. In the end, the jury found Socrates guilty, a decision that was less about the charges and more about silencing a voice that had become too loud and too influential for comfort. The sentence, death by hemlock, a harsh penalty, but one that suited the dramatic narrative of the time. Socrates' execution was as much a statement about the fragility of Athenian democracy as it was about his supposed crimes. It was a reminder that even in a society that prided itself on free thought and debate, there were limits to how far one could go in questioning the status quo. So, here we have a city in turmoil, a philosopher who refused to play by the rules, and a trial that was more about politics than justice. It's a story that echoes through history, reminding us of the delicate balance between free thought and societal stability. While Socrates' death was a tragic end to a brilliant mind, it also marked the beginning of his enduring legacy. His trial and execution were not the silencing of a philosopher, but the starting point for a philosophical tradition that would influence generations to come. In the grand scheme of things, Socrates' trial was a moment of high drama in the Athenian theatre, a performance that revealed as much about the city as it did about the man himself. And though the details might be lost in the annals of time, the questions he raised continue to resonate, challenging us to think, to question, and to seek the truth in a world that often prefers the comfort of easy answers. As we leave this chapter, remember, Socrates may have been put on trial, but his ideas remain free, buzzing around like the gadfly he once claimed to be. And so, with the courtroom drama behind him, Socrates found himself facing the aftermath of a trial that seemed more of a theatrical tragedy than a quest for justice. You'd think a man sentenced to death might recoil at the thought, but not our Socrates. His calm acceptance of his fate was as baffling to his followers as it was to his detractors. To him, it was just another philosophical puzzle, one to be pondered rather than lamented. Picture this, a dimly lit prison cell, barely large enough to swing an Athenian cat. Yet within its confines, Socrates continued to engage in the very activity that got him there, philosophical discourse. The man just couldn't help himself. While lesser souls might have spent their final days in despair or denial, Socrates took to his imprisonment like a fish to water, swimming through ideas with the same fervor he'd shown in the agora. Now, let's talk about those philosophical conversations he had while waiting for the hemlock party. These weren't just idle musings. They were intense, profound dialogues with his followers, who were more like a troupe of distraught philosophers in training. Socrates' imprisonment became a sort of Socratic salon, where the looming spectre of death only sharpened the discussions. It was here that he famously explored concepts of the soul's immortality, the nature of justice, and the essence of a good life. Heavy stuff for a guy with a limited time on his hands. Crito, one of Socrates' closest friends, desperately tried to convince him to escape. And why not? Bribing the guards wouldn't have been too difficult. A few drachmas here, a persuasive argument there, and Socrates could have been on his way to a quiet life in exile. But for Socrates, that would have been too easy, too mundane, like asking a master chef to microwave a frozen dinner. In his mind, escaping would mean betraying his principles and the laws of Athens, the very ones he had spent his life questioning. Besides, he had a point to prove, one that was bigger than his own life. The irony of Socrates' calm acceptance of his fate was not lost on his followers, who were anything but calm. They were more like a group of frantic chickens running around the philosophical barnyard. Their beloved teacher was about to drink the ultimate cocktail, and here he was, casually discussing the virtues of the soul and the afterlife, as if he had all the time in the world. While they saw tragedy, Socrates saw an opportunity to demonstrate his teachings in action. His final hours were spent in conversation, not in tearful goodbyes. He discussed the immortality of the soul with a steady conviction that both comforted and confounded his listeners. To Socrates, death was not an end but a transition, a mere stepping stone to a greater understanding. It was a bold stance, one that elevated him from a mere mortal to a philosophical legend. And then there was the hemlock, a grim reminder that ancient Athens was not all sunshine and philosophical debate. The state had sentenced him to drink this deadly brew, a concoction that would gently, yet firmly, escort him from the world of the living. It was a method both efficient and dramatic, a fitting end for a man who had lived his life in pursuit of truth at any cost. The cost of hemlock itself wasn't exactly sky-high. After all, it was just a plant, albeit one with a particularly lethal side effect. But its symbolic value was priceless, a stark reminder that even the greatest minds could be silenced by the fears of lesser ones. As Socrates lifted the cup to his lips, he remained unflinching. His followers, on the other hand, were a mess, their emotions as raw as the Athenian olives they'd eaten for lunch. But to Socrates, this was just another moment to teach. His last words urged his followers to continue questioning, to seek truth wherever it might lead them. It's a poignant image, Socrates, surrounded by his weeping disciples, calmly sipping his fate while imparting wisdom to the very end. His death was not just a personal tragedy, but a powerful philosophical statement. It was a declaration that ideas, once set free, could not be contained, not even by the finality of death. Socrates became a martyr for free thought, a symbol of intellectual courage that would inspire countless others. In dying, he had ensured that his legacy would live on, resonating through the ages like the echo of a gadfly's wings. So, what's the take-home here, aside from the reminder to read the fine print of your local government's legal system? It's the enduring power of ideas, the realization that even in the face of death, one can remain true to their principles. Socrates' calm acceptance of his fate was not an act of resignation, but a final, profound statement of his beliefs. He showed that the examined life, even when cut short, was a life well lived. In the grand tapestry of history, Socrates' death was a pivotal thread, weaving together themes of justice, philosophy, and the eternal struggle between individual thought and societal conformity. His hemlock-fueled exit from the world stage was anything but the end. It was the opening act for a legacy that would ignite the fires of philosophical inquiry for generations to come. And as we leave Socrates at this moment, poised on the brink of eternity, we are reminded of the timeless nature of his questions. They beckon us to explore, to challenge, and to seek answers in a world that often prefers the simplicity of unquestioned beliefs. So raise a metaphorical glass, not of hemlock, mind you, but of whatever drink fuels your own quest for truth. Here's to Socrates, the philosopher who dared to think, even as he faced the ultimate silence. And just like that, Socrates' philosophical journey came to a close, leaving behind a legacy that was anything but ordinary. His death may have been a somber affair, but what followed was a legacy that would ripple through time like a philosophical tsunami. Enter Plato, Socrates' most famous disciple, who, with a pen as mighty as any sword, took it upon himself to immortalize his teacher's thoughts. If Socrates was the gadfly, then Plato was the scribe, documenting the buzz in a series of dialogues that would become the bedrock of Western philosophy. Plato wasn't just a passive observer in Socrates' shadow. He was a thinker in his own right, crafting a philosophical system that built on Socratic questioning, but ventured into realms that even Socrates hadn't dared to tread. Founded in 387 BCE, Plato's Academy became the intellectual hub of Athens, a place where the curious could gather to ponder the mysteries of existence. It wasn't just any educational institution. It was the Ivy League of its day, minus the hefty tuition fees. Here, students engaged in debates and dialogues, continuing the tradition of relentless inquiry that Socrates had championed. Through Plato, Socrates' ideas gained momentum, evolving into a comprehensive worldview that explored everything from the nature of reality to the essence of justice. The Socratic method, that relentless pursuit of truth through questioning, became a staple of teaching at the Academy. It was philosophy's version of a never-ending game of 20 questions, where the goal was not to find the right answer, but to ask the right questions. Plato's dialogues, such as the Republic, were less about providing clear-cut answers and more about challenging assumptions, a tradition that continues to irritate and inspire students to this day. But let's not put on rose-colored glasses just yet. It's tempting to view Socrates as the archetypal wise old sage, a man of unyielding virtue and unassailable wisdom. The reality, however, is a bit more, shall we say, textured. Socrates was a man of contradictions, a stone-mason turned philosopher, a soldier who championed peace, a man who eschewed wealth yet attracted the wealthy to his cause. The romantic image of Socrates as a humble martyr for truth is, of course, appealing, but it glosses over the more mundane aspects of his life. He wasn't above a good argument, and his penchant for challenging authority didn't exactly make him popular at dinner parties. And while his death was tragic, it was also a calculated act of defiance, a final stand that cemented his place in history. Still, there's something undeniably powerful about Socrates' story, a man who stood firm in his convictions, even when those convictions led to a cup of hemlock. It's a narrative that's been romanticized over the centuries, with Socrates cast as the ultimate underdog challenging the might of Athens. Yet, let's not forget that Socrates wasn't a lone voice crying in the wilderness. He was part of a vibrant intellectual community, a city alive with debate and dissent. His trial and execution were less about silencing a single philosopher and more about a society grappling with the very nature of free thought. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and Socrates' influence shows no signs of waning. His legacy, carried forward by Plato and furthered by Aristotle, laid the groundwork for the development of Western philosophy. The Socratic method has become a staple in educational systems worldwide, a timeless reminder that asking questions is often more valuable than providing answers. His ideas about ethics, virtue, and the examined life continue to resonate, shaping everything from legal systems to modern psychology. And let's not forget popular culture, where Socrates has become something of a philosophical celebrity. His likeness, with that iconic beard and furrowed brow, adorns everything from t-shirts to coffee mugs. He's been referenced in movies, TV shows, and even video games, often as the quintessential wise man offering cryptic advice. But one has to wonder, would Socrates approve of his status as a pop culture icon? Probably not. After all, he was a man who shunned material wealth and societal accolades, preferring the simple life of a thinker. Socrates' enduring appeal lies in his unwavering commitment to truth, a truth not defined by dogma, but by dialogue. He didn't just question the world around him, he questioned himself, a radical act of intellectual self-examination that continues to inspire. As we reflect on his life, it becomes clear that his true legacy isn't found in the grandiose myths or the romanticized tales of martyrdom. Instead, it's in the countless minds he's inspired to think critically, to challenge the status quo, and to seek knowledge in a world that often settles for surface-level understanding. In the end, Socrates was a man who dared to ask, why in a world content with because? His life was a testament to the power of questions, a reminder that the pursuit of truth is the highest form of wisdom. And as we close the book on his story, we're left with the realization that Socrates' greatest gift wasn't in providing answers, but in teaching us to never stop asking questions. In a corner of France, so remote that even the cows had a hard time finding excitement, Joan of Arc was born in 1412. Welcome to Domremy, a village so small and quaint that sleepy would be an understatement. If you blinked, you might miss it, and if you sneezed, the whole town would probably say, "Bless you," in unison. But this sleepy hamlet was about to become the unlikely starting point for a saga that would shake the very foundations of France and take a teenage peasant girl from zero to hero faster than you can say divine intervention. Now, let's talk about France in the early 15th century. If you think modern politics are chaotic, imagine a time when the country was split like a bad breakup playlist. The 100 Years' War was raging. Imagine a war that lasts longer than your favorite TV series. It was France versus England, with a side of civil war thrown in for good measure. The French crown was about as stable as a three-legged chair, with Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, adding to the chaos with his less-than-stellar track record. His bouts of insanity were legendary. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass. No kidding. Enter Charles VII, the Dauphin, a king-in-waiting who might have waited a bit too long if it weren't for a certain maid of Orleans. Charles wasn't exactly inspiring confidence. He was more skeptical than saintly, and with good reason. The country was in tatters, the English were breathing down his neck, and his own legitimacy was as shaky as a house of cards. It was a time when divine right was more of a suggestion than a rule, and Charles needed a miracle, or maybe just a really effective PR campaign. And here's where Joan of Arc enters stage left, with a story that sounds like it was ripped straight from the pages of a medieval comic book. By the age of 13, yes, just a teenager, Joan began to claim she was hearing voices. But these weren't the usual teenage rebellious thoughts. Nope, Joan heard voices from saints themselves. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. Talk about having a holy entourage. These celestial consultants told her it was her mission to save France. They didn't offer a 401 K or dental, but Joan was convinced. Joan's family, understandably, thought she'd gone a bit bonkers. But in a time when people were more inclined to believe in miracles than in meteorology, Joan's visions were a hot topic. She was determined to meet Charles VII and convince him that she was the answer to his problems. Skeptics might have called her delusional, but Joan had the kind of determination that could make a mountain move, or at least make a king listen. Travelling from Domremy to Chinon, where Charles was holed up, was no small feat. It was a journey of about 350 kilometers. Imagine setting off across enemy territory without GPS, Uber, or even a playlist to keep you company. It was the medieval equivalent of a road trip from hell. But Joan wasn't fazed. She dressed in men's clothing, a practical move in a time when women's fashion wasn't exactly battle-ready, and convinced a local noble to give her an escort. When she arrived at Chinon, Charles was skeptical. Who wouldn't be? A teenager claiming divine guidance wasn't exactly a common occurrence. Yet, Joan's sincerity and her uncanny ability to identify the Dauphin in a room full of courtiers piqued his interest. Some say this was a test to prove her divine insight. Others might suggest she simply had a good sense of observation. Either way, she got Charles's attention. Joan's arrival in Chinon set off a chain of events that would be more thrilling than any Netflix drama. Her conviction was contagious, and soon she was given a small army to lead to Orleans, where the English had been laying siege for months. The rest, as they say, is history, but that's a tale for another day. For now, let's just say that Joan's story was one of grit, guts, and a bit of divine guidance. In a world where teenage girls were expected to focus on chores and marriage prospects, Joan of Arc was busy rallying troops and changing the course of a war. Not bad for someone from a village where the biggest excitement was probably the annual sheep shearing contest. Joan of Arc was busy rallying troops, and this was no small feat considering the medieval backdrop was more Game of Thrones than Bridgerton. With her ragtag army, she set off for Orleans, a city that had been under English siege for 7 long months. Imagine trying to get a pizza delivered in that scenario. Orleans was essentially the Alamo of French resistance, and it needed a hero, or at least someone with a lot of chutzpah and a divine calling. Enter Joan, clad in armor and armed with nothing more than some serious conviction, and a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary. Now, let's hit pause for a second and talk about what leading a medieval army actually entailed. Forget the Hollywood glamour of knights in shining armor. This was more like an episode of Survivor, set in the 15th century. Armies were a hodgepodge of knights, mercenaries, and peasants, and they didn't have the luxury of MREs or even a coherent strategy most of the time. Supplies were scarce, logistics were a nightmare, and the whole setup was about as organized as a teenager's bedroom. Yet Joan managed to rally these men with her sheer presence and conviction. Her arrival at Orleans was a spectacle. Think of a medieval parade without the balloons and confetti. The people of Orleans were desperate for a morale boost, and Joan provided just that. The siege of Orleans was a turning point, but not because of any miraculous divine intervention. Nope, It was more about timing and strategy. The English were caught off guard, partly because they couldn't quite wrap their heads around the fact that a teenage girl was leading the charge. Talk about underestimating the competition. Despite the legends, Joan wasn't a military genius in the conventional sense. She wasn't out there drawing battle plans like a medieval Napoleon. Her role was more symbolic, akin to a mascot with a sword. But don't dismiss her impact. Her presence inspired the French troops and disheartened the English, who were starting to wonder if God might actually be on the French side after all. The siege was lifted on May 8, 1429, a date now celebrated in Orleans as Joan of Arc Day, because who doesn't love a good underdog story? But let's not get too carried away by the romance of it all. The realities of medieval warfare were gritty, and the concept of chivalry was more myth than practice. Battles were brutal, disease was rampant, and survival was never guaranteed. The English forces weren't vanquished by divine winds or angelic interventions. It was more about strategic missteps on their part, and Joan's uncanny ability to galvanize her troops against all odds. The economic context of the time played a critical role too. The 100 Years' War had drained resources and left towns like Orleans starved for trade and supplies. The lifting of the siege not only boosted morale, but also had economic implications. Commerce resumed, and the flow of goods revitalized the local economy. Joan's victory at Orleans was pivotal, not just for its military implications, but for the economic lifeline it threw to the beleaguered city. This success bolstered Joan's reputation, and she became a symbol of French resilience. Soon enough, she was off to bigger challenges, like getting Charles VII crowned at Reims, a move that was both political and symbolic. But before we crown Charles, let's not forget that the medieval political landscape was as treacherous as a snake pit. Loyalties were fickle, alliances were transient, and trust was a commodity scarcer than gold. Joan was navigating this political minefield with the determination of someone who genuinely believed she had God on speed dial. Her meteoric rise from peasant to military leader was nothing short of extraordinary, but it wasn't just divine destiny. It was a mix of boldness, timing, and a touch of strategic luck. Joan's story is a testament to the power of belief and the impact of a single determined individual on the course of history. Yet it's crucial to peel back the layers of legend to see the gritty reality beneath. She wasn't a saint wielding a magical sword, but a young woman with a vision and the courage to act on it. So, as Joan gears up for her next chapter, keep in mind that the road ahead is fraught with challenges. The stakes are high, and not everyone is thrilled about a teenage girl shaking up the status quo. But that's a tale for another time, as Joan's journey continues to unfold in ways that will surprise and perhaps even inspire those who dare to dream as she did. Stay tuned, because if you thought the Siege of Orleans was dramatic, you ain't seen nothing yet. And so, with the Siege of Orleans behind her, Joan's legend grew faster than a viral tick-tock dance. But in the medieval world, where allegiances were as stable as a Jenga tower on a windy day, fame was a double-edged sword. Joan's victories had made her a household name, but not everyone was thrilled about the new peasant celebrity crashing the noble party. Politically speaking, the aftermath of Joan's triumph was like a medieval soap opera. Imagine a game of chess where the pieces argue about which side they're on. On one hand, you had the Armagnacs, who were all about Team Charles VII. On the other, the Burgundians, who were like the frenemies of the French crown, often siding with the English because, well, nothing says, let's be complicated, like a medieval alliance. In between, Joan, with her divine mission and growing influence, was the wild card nobody saw coming. The English, licking their wounds from the Orleans defeat, were plotting their next move. They weren't exactly keen on letting this teenage Wonder Woman upset the balance of power. To them, Joan was a dangerous anomaly, a peasant girl defying social norms and military logic. She was a glitch in their matrix, and glitches, as we know, need fixing. Meanwhile, within France, Joan's rising star was causing a stir. Her success was as divisive as pineapple on pizza. Admirers saw her as the savior of France, while skeptics and political rivals viewed her as a threat to the established order. Now, let's talk about Charles VII for a moment, the man who Joan had basically dragged to Reims for his coronation in 1429. Charles was finally crowned, and while he might have felt like the king, Joan's presence was a constant reminder that his ascent to power wasn't exactly conventional. It was like being handed the keys to a shiny new car, only to find out the warranty was a teenage girl's divine inspiration. The French court was a hotbed of intrigue, with power players maneuvering like chess masters on caffeine. Joan's straightforward approach clashed with the subtlety of court politics, where a misplaced word could end careers faster than a scandalous tweet. As Joan continued her military campaigns, her influence and unconventional methods drew both admiration and envy. She was a breath of fresh air, sure, but in a room full of musty old nobles that wasn't always welcome. It was less rah-rah and more who does she think she is. The higher she climbed, the more precarious her position became. Joan's support was broad but not deep. She had gained the trust of the common people and soldiers, but the nobility was another story. They were wary of her influence, her visions, and the audacity to believe that she could change the world order with nothing more than faith and a sword. By 1430, Joan was on the front lines again, this time in Campigny. But here her luck ran out, captured by the Burgundians during a skirmish, because medieval warfare was more unpredictable than a toddler with a crayon. Joan was about to discover just how fickle political alliances could be. The Burgundians had no plans to keep their prize hidden away. Instead, they saw a golden opportunity to cash in, like desperate eBay sellers with a rare collectible. They sold Joan to the English for a cool 10,000 livres, about what it would cost to launch a small army or host a very extravagant medieval banquet. This transaction was less about the money and more about removing a thorn from the side of English ambitions. Joan's capture was a seismic event. For the English, it was like capturing the Queen Bee. If they could discredit her, they could undermine the very morale that had turned the tide against them. For the French, it was a gut punch. The symbol of their resurgence was now in enemy hands, and her fate was as uncertain as a medieval weather forecast. The Burgundians' sale of Joan wasn't just a business transaction. It was a move in the greater chess game of European politics. They'd effectively traded a piece of high-stakes leverage for a tidy sum, a reflection of how alliances could shift with the tides of opportunity. As a prisoner, Joan's situation was grim. She was a high-profile captive, and the English weren't about to let her go without making an example. Her capture marked the beginning of her downfall, a tragic turning point in a story that had felt, until now, like it was on an unstoppable ascent. The English planned to put Joan on trial, not just to punish her, but to delegitimize her claims of divine guidance. In their eyes, she was a heretic, a witch, and a political tool wrapped in one, and they intended to use her trial as propaganda to justify their continued claim to the French throne. Meanwhile, the economic context shouldn't be ignored. The war was a financial drain on both sides, and the capture of Joan was seen as a morale booster for the English, a way to justify the continued expenses of a seemingly endless conflict. The powers vying for control were not just in it for glory, but for economic supremacy. The 100 Years' War was as much about resources and power as it was about land and lineage. Joan's capture was a temporary win for English morale, a much-needed boost for their war-weary forces. And so, Joan found herself facing her greatest challenge yet. No longer in command of an army, she was now a pawn in a political game that was way above her pay grade. The stakes were higher than ever, and the young woman from Domremy was about to learn just how ruthless her adversaries could be. Her story, one of grit and faith, was entering its darkest chapter, and the world watched with bated breath to see what would become of the Maid of Orleans. As the political chess game unfolded, Joan's fate hung in the balance, her legacy teetering between martyrdom and oblivion. But that's a tale for another time, as the drama of Joan's life continues to play out in ways both tragic and inspiring. Stay tuned, because the story of Joan of Arc is far from over, and the best, or perhaps the worst, is yet to come. As Joan of Arc awaited her fate, the medieval justice system was gearing up to showcase its own version of a legal thriller, minus the suspense, and with a lot more parchment. Imagine a courtroom drama where the script was already written, and the jury was about as impartial as a sports fan at the Super Bowl. Welcome to Joan's trial for heresy, a bureaucratic spectacle that would make Kafka proud. The trial, held in Rouen in 1431, wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message. And who better to deliver that message than Pierre Corchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, whose name might as well have been Bias, with a capital B. Corchon had as much interest in Joan's innocence as a cat has in a cucumber. He was a staunch supporter of the English, and his goal was clear: discredit Joan, the pesky thorn in England's side. Now let's talk about the trial itself, a masterclass in medieval legal farce. Picture a dimly lit room, filled with clerics and scholars, all eager to see the Maid of Orleans humbled. Joan, standing before them, was not just fighting for her life, but for her legacy. The charges: heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing, a veritable buffet of medieval no-nos. Let's start with the heresy charge. Joan's claim that she received direct instructions from God was as welcome as a wasp at a picnic for the church hierarchy. The clerics weren't too keen on anyone cutting out the middleman, especially a teenage girl. They grilled Joan on her visions, trying to catch her in a theological trap. But Joan was no pushover. Her responses were sharp, her wit like a slap in the face of their condescension. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she famously retorted, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God so keep me." Then there was the witchcraft accusation. In a time when any woman with an independent thought was at risk of being labeled a witch, Joan was public enemy number one. She had led armies, for heaven's sake. To the English, she was practically the poster girl for supernatural meddling. But the reality was less about spells and more about strategy. Joan's success on the battlefield was due to her charisma and timing, not some magical mojo. Yet the myth of her witchcraft was a convenient tool for her enemies, a way to paint her as an unholy aberration rather than a savvy military leader. And of course, let's not forget the cross-dressing charge, the medieval equivalent of a wardrobe malfunction scandal. Joan had donned men's clothing for practical reasons. Armor wasn't exactly tailored for women, and it offered protection in more ways than one. But her choice of attire was spun into evidence of heresy, as if pants were a gateway to the dark arts. The clerics were scandalized, ignoring the fact that Joan's sartorial choices were a survival tactic in a man's world. The trial transcripts reveal the lengths to which Corchon and his cronies went to trip her up. Over the course of several months, Joan faced nearly a dozen public interrogations, each more grueling than the last. Her resilience was remarkable, her defiance palpable. She was a lone woman standing against a tide of institutional power, her spirit unbroken even as the verdict seemed preordained. Amidst this legal circus, it's important to remember the economic and political stakes. The English needed Joan discredited to justify their claim to the French throne. Her trial wasn't just about her. It was about the legitimacy of a war that had drained coffers and cost thousands of lives. By labeling her a heretic and a witch, the English aimed to undermine the morale of the French, showing that their divine messenger was nothing more than a fraud. Yet, Joan's trial also highlighted the limits of medieval justice, which was more about reinforcing power structures than seeking truth. The verdict was as inevitable as rain in a British summer. Joan was found guilty of heresy, a decision as shocking as finding sand at the beach. On May 30, 1431, she was burned at the stake, her life extinguished but her legend ignited. Her execution was intended to erase her influence, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of fading into obscurity, Joan became a martyr, her story a rallying cry for those who dared to dream of a free France. The myth of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, was solidified in the flames that consumed her. In the end, Joan's trial was a testament to the power of belief and the danger of challenging the status quo. It was a grim reminder of how far authorities would go to silence dissent and maintain control. Yet, it also underscored the resilience of the human spirit, the ability of one woman to stand against insurmountable odds and leave a mark on history. As we ponder Joan's legacy, it's crucial to separate the myth from the reality. She wasn't a saint with a magic sword or a witch with a cauldron. She was a young woman with a vision and the audacity to act on it, a symbol of courage and conviction in a world desperate for change. Her story continues to resonate, a beacon of inspiration for those who dare to challenge the impossible. And so, as the embers of her trial smoulder, Joan's journey is far from over. The aftermath of her execution will ripple through history, shaping the course of nations and the hearts of people. Stay tuned, because the saga of Joan of Arc is not merely a tale of medieval woe, but a timeless story of resilience and hope. And just like that, Joan of Arc's flame was snuffed out, but the embers of her legend were only beginning to catch fire. Her execution in 1431 was supposed to be the ultimate silencer, yet it became the spark that ignited her transformation from a condemned heretic to a national hero. It's like the ultimate plot twist in a medieval drama where the villain's plan backfires spectacularly. Let's start with the immediate aftermath. You'd think the English, having finally rid themselves of the Maid of Orleans, would be popping the medieval equivalent of champagne. But Joan's death did something unexpected. It galvanized the French. Her martyrdom became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against foreign occupation. Picture it. A teenage girl, now a martyr, inspiring a nation to rise from the ashes of humiliation. The irony was almost poetic. Fast forward to 1456, a good 25 years after Joan met her fiery end. The political landscape had shifted like sand dunes in a desert storm. The 100 Years' War was winding down, and the French were on the upswing. Enter Charles VII, the once tentative dauphin, now a full-fledged king. He owed his crown, in part, to Joan's early victories, and was finally in a position to repay that debt. Cue the rehabilitation trial, a posthumous PR campaign to clear Joan's name. This nullification trial wasn't just about justice, it was about rewriting history. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a director's cut, where the hero gets the ending they deserve. The trial was held in Paris, with dozens of witnesses testifying to Joan's character and the sham nature of her original trial. The verdict: Joan was officially cleared of all charges. It was a symbolic victory, but one that laid the groundwork for her eventual canonization. Now, let's jump to 1920, a leap that might give you historical whiplash, but stick with me. The world had changed dramatically. World War I had just ended, leaving Europe battered and bruised. Nationalism was on the rise, and France, eager to reclaim its past glories, looked to its historical icons for inspiration. Enter Joan of Arc, a figure whose story of resilience and patriotism resonated deeply with a nation rebuilding itself. On May 16, 1920, Joan was canonized by Pope Benedict XV. She was now Saint Joan, a patroness of soldiers and a symbol of unwavering faith. Her sainthood was more than just a religious accolade, it was a reflection of the times. Joan became the ultimate embodiment of French spirit, a unifying figure in a country still healing from the scars of war. Her canonization was a testament to the shifting sands of history, showing how narratives evolve to meet the needs of the present. But the story doesn't end there. Joan of Arc's legacy extends beyond church walls and history books. She's a cultural icon, popping up in everything from literature to film to video games. Her image has been adapted and reimagined, each version reflecting the era's values and aspirations. From Mark Twain's historical novel, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, to the 1999 film, The Messenger, Joan's story continues to captivate and inspire. Why does Joan of Arc endure in our collective memory? Perhaps it's because her tale is the ultimate underdog story, one of grit, faith, and defiance against seemingly insurmountable odds. Or maybe it's the timeless allure of a young woman who dared to defy the status quo, challenging both societal norms and military might. Joan's legend offers a rich tapestry of inspiration and caution, a reminder of both the power of conviction and the peril of challenging entrenched power structures. Let's not forget the economic and political contexts that have shaped Joan's legacy over the centuries. Her story has been used as a tool for national unity, a way to bolster morale in times of crisis. It's a fascinating example of how historical figures can be repurposed to serve contemporary needs, their narratives molded to fit the zeitgeist. Joan's journey from heretic to saint underscores the fluidity of history, where past events are constantly reinterpreted through the lens of present-day values. So, where does that leave us? Joan of Arc's legacy is a complex interplay of myth and reality, a story that continues to evolve as each generation finds new meaning in her life and death. She's a symbol of resilience and courage, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, one person can indeed make a difference. Her story is as much about faith as it is about the human spirit's enduring quest for justice and truth. In the end, Joan of Arc is more than just a historical figure. She's a mirror reflecting our hopes, fears, and aspirations. Her legacy is a testament to the power of belief and the enduring impact of one determined individual on the course of history. Whether as a saint, a warrior, or a symbol of national pride, Joan of Arc's story resonates as a timeless tale of courage and conviction. And as history continues to unfold, her legacy will undoubtedly inspire future generations to dream, act, and perhaps even change the world. In the world of 14th century Europe, the medieval banquet was the ultimate Instagram post, a status update before social media was even a twinkle in history's eye. These feasts weren't just about stuffing your face with roast boar. They were the ultimate flex of wealth and power, a way for nobles to strut their stuff without ever having to say a word. If you were lucky enough to snag an invite, you better know your place, literally. Who sat where was more important than the menu itself, and getting it wrong could turn a noble's reputation into yesterday's leftovers. Let's dive into the absurdity of these seating arrangements. In today's world, you might argue over who gets the aisle seat on a flight, but in medieval times, it was all about proximity to the host. The closer you sat to the top dog, the more prestigious you appeared. It was like the medieval version of being tagged in a celebrity's post, being seated far from the host, social Siberia. You might as well have stayed home. The head of the table was reserved for the lord or king, and sitting there was akin to being knighted on the spot. But don't think you could just plop down wherever you fancied. Where you sat could seriously impact your social standing, and not in a good way. Now, let's talk costs because, despite what you might think, these shindigs weren't cheap. Hosting a banquet could cost a noble up to half their annual income. That's right, they were shelling out 50% of their earnings just to show off. Imagine spending half your salary on a single party today. Your accountant would have a heart attack. But for the medieval elite, it was an investment in their social capital. Nobles wanted to be seen as magnanimous, overflowing with generosity and wealth, even if it meant eating porridge for the rest of the year. And before you picture everyone in the village getting an invite, think again. Peasants were left out in the cold, literally. These feasts were all about exclusivity, and if you were a serf, you'd have more luck crashing a royal wedding than getting a seat at one of these tables. And let's not forget the staging of it all. The banquet hall was decked out like a medieval rapper's dream. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting heroic deeds and noble lineages. Think of them as the original brag sheets. Lavish decorations were essential to impress the guests and remind them of the host's importance. If you were a noble, this was your chance to flaunt your family crest and make sure everyone knew just who they were dining with. But the real spectacle was the food, an array of dishes that would make a modern foodie swoon. Forget about the nutritional pyramid. This menu was more like a ladder of indulgence. Exotic spices, imported from distant lands, were used liberally to show off wealth and connections. Saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg were sprinkled like gold dust over dishes that ranged from pies filled with game birds to elaborate stews. And let's not forget the piece de resistance, the subtlety. This was a dish so extravagant it was more art than food, designed to impress and astonish. It might be a peacock served in its own feathers or a pie that exploded with live birds. Basically, if it didn't make your jaw drop, they weren't trying hard enough. So why did they go to all this trouble? Status, pure and simple. The nobility were in a constant game of one-upmanship, and a banquet was their chance to shine. It was a way to cement alliances, secure marriages, and maybe, just maybe, get into the king's good graces. Throwing a successful feast could elevate your standing, or, at the very least, keep you from falling behind in the social race. Of course, the reality wasn't always as glamorous as the legends suggest. While we might love the idea of chivalrous knights and noble ladies clinking goblets, the truth is, it was a lot of hard work, a ton of money, and maybe a little too much emphasis on who sat where and why. But then again, who doesn't love a good party, especially when it involves peacocks and exploding pies? In the end, these banquets were not just about the food or the company. They were a snapshot of the times, a blend of extravagance and social maneuvering that would make even the most seasoned social climber pause. If it sounds like these medieval shindigs were just one long parade of meats and merriment, well, you're not entirely wrong. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The menu itself was a culinary Rubik's Cube, as much about art as it was about eating. Picture this, a medieval banquet wasn't just a meal. It was a stage show with food as the star. The menu was a smorgasbord of extravagance and ingenuity designed to dazzle both the eyes and the palate. And trust me, the cooks were the unsung heroes, culinary maestros, who could have given today's celebrity chefs a serious run for their money. First up, let's talk about the medieval version of farm to table. Except in this case, it was more like castle to table, with a few notable differences. Your typical medieval banquet wasn't about local, organic produce. It was about peacocks, swans, and other exotic critters that seemed more at home in a fairy tale than on a dinner plate. Peacocks, for example, weren't just cooked and served. They were cooked, redressed in their plumage, and presented as if they were about to strut off the table. Talk about a showstopper. It was like dining on a piece of art, albeit one with a lot of feathers. And then there were swans, another avian delicacy that screamed wealth and exclusivity. These weren't your average pond-dwelling birds. They were a status symbol, the 14th century equivalent of driving a luxury sports car. Swans were so highly prized that laws were enacted to determine who could own them. If you weren't of noble birth, you had a better chance of becoming a knight than getting your hands on one of these feathered trophies. Eating swan was a privilege, a literal taste of the high life. But it wasn't just about the birds. Medieval banquets were also a treasure trove of spices and flavors that had traveled further than most of the guests. Saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg were the holy trinity of medieval spice racks, imported from the far corners of the world at significant cost. To put it in perspective, a pound of saffron could set you back as much as a horse. These spices weren't just for flavor. They were a status symbol, a way for the host to flaunt their far-reaching connections and deep pockets. It was the medieval way of saying, "Look at me, I know people." Of course, the piece de resistance, or subtlety, as it was known, was where things got really wild. Subtleties were dishes designed to impress with their sheer ridiculousness, culinary illusions that were part art installation, part food. Imagine a pie that, when cut open, released live birds. Yes, they actually did this. It was like something out of a bizarre medieval variety show, designed to elicit gasps and applause in equal measure. And if you think that sounds impractical, remember that the point wasn't practicality, it was spectacle. These dishes were as much about the wow factor as they were about nourishment. Now, let's talk about the real magicians behind these culinary feats, the cooks. In a world without MasterChef, medieval cooks were the unsung rock stars of their time. They had to be artists, scientists, and showmen all rolled into one. Forget about Instagrammable avocado toasts. These guys were creating edible illusions that could fool even the sharpest eyes and palates. They were the silent architects of these feasts, transforming the mundane into the magnificent. And they did it all without the benefit of modern conveniences like ovens or refrigerators. Talk about skill. But while we're busy romanticizing the past, let's not forget the economic reality. All this extravagance came at a price, and I'm not just talking about the cost of a pound of saffron. Hosting a banquet was a financial gamble, especially when your reputation was on the line. Spend too little, and you risked looking cheap. Spend too much, and you might find yourself eating gruel for the rest of the year. It was a delicate balance of ostentation and prudence, a dance of economic prowess that could make or break a noble standing. And while the guests feasted on peacocks and swans, the servants worked tirelessly behind the scenes, a hidden engine driving the spectacle. For them, the banquet was less of a party and more of a marathon, a relentless rush to ensure that everything was perfect. Their labor was invisible but essential, the unsung chorus to the noble's aria. So there it is, the medieval banquet, a heady mix of art and opulence, where every dish told a story and every bite was a statement. It was a world where the line between food and theatre blurred, where the menu was as much about what you could see as what you could taste. And while the romance of it all still captivates us today, the reality was a complex tapestry of social ambition, economic strategy, and culinary genius. It was a time when dinner wasn't just about eating. It was about making history, one peacock at a time. And with that, we've only just begun to peel back the layers of this medieval feast. Stay tuned, because there's plenty more on the menu. And speaking of making history, let's talk about the entertainment at these medieval banquets. If the food was the star, then the entertainment was the supporting cast, bringing the drama and flair that turned a feast into an unforgettable event. Forget Netflix. In the 14th century, troubadours, jesters, and minstrels were the original binge-worthy content, each performance a live episode of courtly intrigue and comedic relief. Now, these troubadours were no ordinary street performers. Think of them as the rock stars of the medieval world, traveling bards who specialized in tales of chivalry, romance, and, every now and then, a bit of scandal. Their songs were like medieval mixtapes, blending poetry with melody to enchant audiences and occasionally deliver a sly message to those in power. If a lord had an unpopular policy, a troubadour might weave a tale critiquing it, cloaked in enough metaphor to avoid a one-way trip to the dungeons. In a world where speaking out could land you in hot water, or worse, a cleverly crafted verse was a troubadour's best defense. Jesters, on the other hand, were the medieval version of stand-up comedians, complete with their own brand of edgy humor. But don't let the jingle bells on their hats fool you. These jesters were smart, sharp, and knew exactly how far they could push their luck. They specialized in satire, poking fun at the nobility and court life, often walking a fine line between comedy and calamity. A misplaced insult could mean curtains for a jester, so they honed their craft with the precision of a surgeon. They were the court's pressure valve, using laughter to diffuse tension and occasionally prod the powerful with a barbed jest or two. Then there were the minstrels, the DJs of the medieval scene, providing the musical backdrop to the evening's festivities. Music wasn't just a pleasant distraction. It was a key element in setting the mood and pace of the entire banquet. From lively dances to solemn ballads, the right tune could mean the difference between a memorable night and a complete flop. Minstrels played everything from lutes to hurdy-gurdies, and let me tell you, if a lute string snapped mid-performance, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a minor catastrophe. Imagine the medieval equivalent of your favorite song suddenly cutting out at the club. Talk about a buskill. Dance was another essential part of the evening's entertainment, though it wasn't as carefree as it might sound. Each dance was a carefully choreographed display of grace and poise, often used to showcase the host's refinement and the participants' social skills. The nobles twirled and stepped in intricate patterns, each movement a testament to their upbringing and status. And if you think a dance was just a dance, think again. The right partner could signal a budding alliance or a potential marriage, while a misstep could lead to gossip that lasted longer than the night itself. But here's the kicker. These performances weren't just about fun and games. They were steeped in political undertones, a theatrical chessboard where each move could curry favor or deliver a veiled insult. Nobles used entertainment as a tool to communicate, often saying more through a jest or a song than they could in direct conversation. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy, where the wrong word could end a career and the right note could elevate one. Take, for instance, the famous tale of the troubadour Bertrand de Born, known for his sharp tongue and sharper lyrics. He once crafted a song that criticized King Henry II of England, veiling his barbs in poetic language that was both biting and beautiful. Despite the risk, his boldness paid off, earning him a reputation as a fearless critic, though it's worth noting that not every troubadour was so lucky. Some found themselves banished or worse, proving that the medieval world had little tolerance for those who couldn't master the art of subtlety. And let's not forget the economic side of all this entertainment. Hiring a troupe of performers wasn't cheap, and for a noble hosting a banquet, the quality of the entertainment was a reflection of their wealth and status. A lackluster performance could tarnish a host's reputation faster than you could say, roasted peacock. This meant that nobles often went to great lengths to secure the best performers, sometimes even engaging in a bit of espionage to outdo a rival's party. In a world where appearances were everything, the right entertainment could elevate a banquet from ordinary to legendary. In the end, the entertainment at a medieval banquet was far more than a sideshow. It was a crucial element of the event, a blend of art and politics that kept the court entertained while subtly reinforcing social hierarchies and power dynamics. Whether through a cleverly crafted song or a well-timed jest, performers played their part in the grand tapestry of medieval life, adding color and vibrancy to the otherwise rigid structure of the feudal world. As we delve deeper into the spectacle of these medieval feasts, it's clear that they were as much about performance as they were about food and drink. The entertainment was a reflection of the times, a means of communication, and a vehicle for social change disguised as light-hearted fun. So the next time you find yourself at a party, remember that the dance floor isn't just a place for footwork. It's a stage for history, one step at a time. And with that, we continue to unravel the layers of the medieval banquet, where every jest, song, and dance was a chapter in the story of the times. Stay tuned, because the plot is only thickening. So, as we peel back the next layer of this medieval onion, let's dive into the logistical ballet that was hosting a banquet in the 14th century. Picture it. A grand spectacle involving enough planning to make a modern wedding planner break out in a cold sweat. Forget cozy gatherings. These were full-blown productions that required an army of workers, each with a role as critical as the next. At the heart of this culinary chaos was the medieval event planner. Before you roll your eyes, thinking of Pinterest boards and color swatches, hold that thought. These folks were more like military generals than party coordinators, orchestrating everything from the menu to the seating chart with the precision of a chess master. A single slip-up could mean disaster. A spilled goblet of wine might as well have been a diplomatic incident. Let's talk numbers. A typical banquet could easily involve upwards of 200 guests, and that's just the nobility. Factor in the servants, cooks, and entertainers, and you're looking at a small village's worth of people. Feeding this horde wasn't just a task. It was an undertaking of Herculean proportions. We're talking about thousands of dishes, hundreds of gallons of ale, and enough tableware to outfit a department store. And speaking of tableware, here's a fun fact. Medieval banquets were a BYOC affair. Bring your own cutlery. That's right, guests toted their own knives to the feast, a personal accessory not unlike today's smartphones. Forks, forget it. Those were still a few centuries away from becoming table staples. Instead, diners made do with knives and, well, their hands. That's right, the original finger food, folks. But back to the logistics. Who was behind this medieval madness? Enter the unsung heroes of the banquet scene, the servants. This was an army of labourers who toiled behind the scenes, their efforts as invisible as they were indispensable. From the scullions scrubbing pots to the cupbearers ensuring no one's goblet ran dry, these individuals were the cogs in the grand machine of medieval revelry. Imagine the scene. A kitchen bustling with activity, fires roaring, cauldrons boiling, and the air thick with the scent of roasting meats and exotic spices. The head cook, a conductor of chaos, orchestrated this symphony of sizzle and steam. A single misstep, say a roasted peacock hitting the floor, could spell disaster. Remember, this wasn't just dinner, it was theatre, and the show had to go on. But let's not sugarcoat it. Behind the glamour and glitz, the reality for these workers was anything but a fairy tale. Long hours, grueling conditions, and the ever-present threat of a noble's displeasure loomed over them. In a world without labour laws, a botched dish could mean more than a bad Yelp review. It could mean losing your livelihood, or worse, your head. As for the sheer volume of food and drink involved, think of it as the medieval version of a Costco run, but with more feathers and fewer plastic packages. A single feast could see the consumption of several oxen, dozens of pigs, and enough poultry to make Colonel Sanders weep. And the drink? Gallons upon gallons of ale and wine, enough to float a ship, or at least a very tipsy rowboat. But why such excess? Well, it wasn't just about feeding the guests. It was a statement, a visual and visceral display of wealth and generosity. The more lavish the spread, the more it cemented the host's status. It was the medieval equivalent of posting your vacation snaps on social media. Look at my life, my connections, my power. Here's where the stakes got really high. Spillage, you see, was more than just a nuisance. It was a potential social catastrophe. Imagine a servant tripping and sending a tray of quail flying, an oopsie that could morph into a scandal quicker than you could say, pass the salt. In the rigid hierarchy of the medieval court, such blunders were not easily forgiven. So, next time you're grumbling about planning a dinner party, spare a thought for these medieval maestros. They didn't have the luxury of online invitations or caterers. It was all hands on deck, with a side of sweat and a sprinkle of stress. And while the glamour of the banquet hall might capture our imaginations, it's the grit and grind behind the scenes that truly made these events possible. And there you have it, an all-access backstage pass to the medieval banquet scene, where logistics met luxury in a dance as intricate as any courtly jig. We're not done yet, though. Stick around as we continue to unravel the tapestry of this historical feast, exploring the stories, the scandals, and the subtle art of medieval hospitality. Stay tuned, because the best, or perhaps the most scandalous, is yet to come. While the medieval banquet dazzled with its spectacle, it also played a pivotal role in shaping the very fabric of 14th century society. These feasts were more than just culinary extravaganzas. They were the social glue of the age, binding the nobility in a web of alliances as complex as a Game of Thrones plot twist. Imagine a high-stakes poker game where every dish, every seat, and every whispered conversation could tip the balance of power. First up, let's talk alliances. In a world where your next-door neighbor was more likely to storm your castle than borrow a cup of sugar, allies were as essential as oxygen. Banquets provided the perfect setting to forge these connections. Nobles gathered not just to indulge, but to negotiate, whispering sweet political nothings over roasted swan and spiced wine. Deals were struck, marriages arranged, and peace treaties brokered, all without leaving the dinner table. It was diplomacy with a side of mutton, a testament to the power of good food and better conversation. But don't let the romance of diplomacy fool you. These gatherings also starkly highlighted the class divides that defined medieval life. The banquets were exclusive affairs, the medieval equivalent of an A-list celebrity bash. While the nobles dined in opulence, the peasants toiled outside, their lives a world away from the feasting halls. The gap between the haves and have-nots was as vast as the banquet tables were long. And the division wasn't just in wealth, but in opportunity. For the lower classes, these banquets were a reminder of their place in the social hierarchy, a visual, visceral reminder that the odds were stacked against them. And let's not forget the myths these feasts have spun. Hollywood loves to paint the medieval banquet as a carefree frolic of knights and ladies, but the reality was much grittier. Sure, there were moments of grandeur, but they came with a side of political tension and economic pressure. Nobles spent fortunes on these events, and failure meant more than an empty purse. It meant a hit to their reputation, something a noble could ill afford. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice with high stakes and higher risks. Yet, as much as we love to debunk the myths, there's a reason they endure. There's something inherently captivating about these feasts, a blend of fantasy and reality that continues to charm us. Maybe it's the spectacle itself, the idea of a world where food, power, and performance intersect in a grand tapestry. Or perhaps it's the human drama, the alliances and betrayals that echo our own lives. Whatever the reason, these banquets remain a symbol of splendor and ambition, a reminder of a time when the world was a stage, and every meal was a performance. So, what do these medieval banquets tell us about human nature? For one, they reveal our enduring love for spectacle and status. Whether it's a 14th century feast or a modern-day gala, the desire to see and be seen remains a constant. We crave the spotlight, the chance to display our wealth, our connections, our power. It's a tale as old as time, a human trait that transcends centuries. They also highlight our penchant for storytelling. The myths of medieval feasts, with their knights in shining armor and damsels in distress, are stories we cherish because they speak to our imaginations. They allow us to escape the mundane, to believe in a world of chivalry and romance, even if the reality was far less charming. We are, at our core, storytellers, weaving narratives that blend fact and fiction in a dance as intricate as any courtly jig. Finally, these banquets underscore the complexities of social and political life. They were arenas where power was displayed and contested, where alliances were forged and broken. In this way, they mirror our own world, where dinner tables are more than just places to eat. They are stages for diplomacy, negotiation, and sometimes confrontation. As we wrap up this journey through the medieval banquet hall, it's worth remembering that these feasts were more than just meals. They were microcosms of the world they inhabited, reflecting the aspirations, tensions, and contradictions of the time. They remind us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience, with all its triumphs and tragedies. So the next time you sit down for a meal, whether it's a lavish dinner or a simple supper, take a moment to ponder the legacy of those medieval feasts. Remember the stories they tell, the myths they inspire, and the truths they reveal about who we are. Because in the end, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the timeless dance of human nature, one banquet at a time. In the dusty village of Mvizo, South Africa, back in the summer of 1918, a tiny bundle of revolutionary potential came into the world, known simply as Rolihlahla Mandela, troublemaker in Xhosa. It's almost like destiny had a sense of humor when it came to names. Rolihlahla would grow up to be none other than Nelson Mandela, a name synonymous with defiance and unity. But before all the Nobel Peace Prizes and presidential accolades, he was just a kid with a knack for dodging chores. Born into the royal Tembu family, young Mandela's life was not exactly what you'd call average. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniuswa, was a chief, but after a little spat over some political disagreements, he found himself on the outs. Talk about a family drama. This left Mandela's mother, No Skinny Fanny, to manage the household, and let's just say Rolihlahla wasn't exactly known for his diligence in helping out. Legend has it, his skill in sidestepping duties around the house was unparalleled, earning him the nickname that foreshadowed his future. Despite the domestic aversion, Mandela's upbringing was steeped in the deep cultural traditions of the Tembu people. The family's royal lineage gave him a front-row seat to leadership dynamics and governance. So, while other kids were playing with marbles, young Nelson was soaking up tribal council meetings like they were the latest episode of a must-watch series. Education was Mandela's ticket out of the rural confines of his early life, and he pursued it with the kind of fervor that would have impressed even the most demanding of tiger moms. He attended a Methodist school where he was christened Nelson by a teacher who probably thought Rolihlahla was just too much of a mouthful. Then it was off to Healdtown, a Wesleyan secondary school, where he proved to be a standout student, although not necessarily for reasons of academic brilliance alone. The real fun began at Fort Hare University, the Harvard of South Africa, where future leaders were molded. Here, Mandela got his first taste of politics and activism, and it was more spicy than sweet. He was elected to the Student Representative Council, a role that quickly turned into a hot seat due to the university's authoritarian policies. Nelson, never one to shy away from a challenge, joined a protest against the administration's restrictive measures. The result, a one-way ticket out of Fort Hare. Yes, Mandela was expelled, proving that even great leaders sometimes have to take a step back to leap forward. His expulsion wasn't exactly a career setback. Instead, it was the spark that ignited the fire of activism within him. He headed to Johannesburg, a city as bustling and chaotic as a beehive on caffeine, and worked a series of odd jobs. Among these was a stint as a night watchman at a mine, a job that likely gave him plenty of time to ponder the inequities around him. With apartheid tightening its grip, Mandela's work experience was less about career advancement and more about survival, and understanding the system he would come to challenge. Mandela's early life was a cocktail of tradition and turmoil, education and eviction. It was a time when the seeds of his revolutionary spirit were sown, watered by the injustices he witnessed and experienced firsthand. He was a man destined for greatness, but not without a few humorous detours along the way. And if you're ever tempted to romanticize "the troubled youth makes good" trope, just remember, sometimes greatness begins with avoiding household chores. Fast forward to 1941, and our young Rolihlala, whom we've come to affectionately call Nelson, found himself in the urban jungle of Johannesburg, the proverbial land of opportunity. But before you start imagining bright city lights and career triumphs, let's introduce some reality checks. We're talking £2 a week jobs, people. That's £2 sterling. Even back then, that was barely enough to keep the lights on, let alone fund any grand revolutionary schemes. Nelson's first gig was as a security guard at a mine. And if you think that sounds like a job where he sat in a booth eating sandwiches, think again. It was less Guardians of the Galaxy and more Guardians of the Underground. This was a role that offered a front-row seat to the exploitation of black miners, many of whom worked in conditions that would make a Dickensian workhouse seem like a day spa. By 1942, Mandela had moved on to working as a clerk in a law firm. It was here that the young troublemaker began to rub shoulders with some key players, people like the astute Walter Sisulu and future partner in change, Oliver Tambo. Ah yes, the myth of the lone hero. It's a compelling narrative, isn't it? The solitary figure standing against tyranny. But let's be real, change is a team sport. Mandela, Sisulu and Tambo were like the Avengers of activism, minus the capes and with a lot more paperwork. Together, they were poised to tackle the monster of apartheid. And speaking of apartheid, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of its laws. These were rules so ridiculous, you'd think they were written on a dare. For instance, there were benches labeled whites only. Benches, as if the color of your skin determined your ability to sit in public spaces. The apartheid regime didn't just segregate people, it tried to segment reality. Imagine living in a world where even your seat choice could be an act of defiance. In 1944, Mandela, along with Sisulu and Tambo, founded the African National Congress Youth League, ANCYL. Picture this. A group of young, fiery activists, not content with the status quo, determined to shake things up. They believed that the older ANC was too passive, too willing to play nice with the ridiculousness that was apartheid. The ANCYL was about action, direct action, and they weren't afraid to make noise. Their strategy was simple but radical for the time. Mass action, strikes, and civil disobedience. If you want change, they argued, you've got to make some noise. They were like the rock stars of resistance, aiming to disrupt the silent acceptance of injustice. And disrupt they did. Their efforts led to the defiance campaign of the early 1950s, which we'll get to in another part, so hold that thought. But back to the 1940s. The ANCYL wasn't just about rallies and protests. It was about building a future where all South Africans could share the same benches and opportunities. They were crafting a vision for a country without racial boundaries, like a utopian canvas splattered with diverse colors. A stark contrast to the monochrome world the apartheid government tried to enforce. So, what does this tell us about Nelson Mandela? That he wasn't a lone ranger riding solo into the sunset of freedom. He was part of a vibrant collective, a network of determined individuals who shared his vision and matched his passion. If Mandela was the face of the movement, then Tambo, Sisulu, and countless others were its backbone, supporting and propelling him forward. As this chapter of Mandela's life unfolds, it becomes clear that even the greatest leaders need a team. The myth of the lone hero is just that, a myth. In reality, change happens when people unite, pooling their strengths, sharing their visions, and sometimes their sandwiches during long strategy sessions. It's the power of we that drives history forward, turning the seemingly impossible into the inevitable. Now, as we leave Mandela and his comrades plotting their next move in the bustling streets of Johannesburg, remember that the story of South Africa's struggle against apartheid is a tapestry woven by many hands. It's a story of shared dreams and collective courage, and it's far from over. But for now, let's savor this moment. Young, ambitious, and ready to change the world with a little help from their friends. As the sun rose on a new decade, Nelson Mandela and his band of merry disruptors were ready to turn the 1950s into a decade of defiance. Quite literally, in fact. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 was the first large-scale, multiracial political mobilization against apartheid laws, and Mandela, by then a prominent figure in the African National Congress, ANC, was at the helm. Think of it as the civil rights movement's South African cousin, only with more legal jargon and less rock and roll. The campaign was all about civil disobedience, a fancy term for we're not going to play by your ridiculous rules anymore. And ridiculous they were. Picture this. Laws so absurd they made your least favorite reality TV plot seem plausible. We're talking pass laws that required black South Africans to carry documents at all times or else face arrest. The campaign aimed to get people to refuse to carry these passes, to sit in whites-only areas, and to generally give the apartheid regime a headache it couldn't ignore. Now, Mandela wasn't just a figurehead, he was a hands-on leader. He traveled the country like a political rock star on tour, rallying support, inspiring action, and occasionally getting himself into hot water with the authorities. The campaign saw more than 8,000 volunteers arrested, and while that might sound like a setback, it was actually a victory of sorts. You see, the goal wasn't just to fight the laws, but to expose the moral bankruptcy of the regime enforcing them. And boy, did they ever. Fast forward to 1955, and the ANC and its allies were ready to take their vision to the next level. Enter the Freedom Charter. Drafted at the Congress of the People in Kliptown, it was a bold manifesto for a new, egalitarian South Africa. The Charter's declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, was revolutionary. It was a document pennied not just with ink, but with hope, a hope that someday the country could rise above its brutal divisions. Of course, the apartheid government responded to the Freedom Charter like a toddler who'd just been told no dessert before dinner, by throwing a tantrum, only with more dire consequences. Their paranoia culminated in the infamous treason trial of 1956, an epic legal saga that dragged on for 5 years and included Mandela among its 156 defendants. The charges: conspiring to overthrow the state. The reality: a desperate attempt to silence voices calling for justice. The treason trial was less courtroom drama and more courtroom comedy at times. Picture marathon sessions where defendants and lawyers alike took day-long lunch breaks, possibly the only trial to make lunchtime a strategic element of legal defense. Mandela, along with his fellow accused, turned the trial into a platform to further publicize their cause. The defendants were a diverse bunch, representing every corner of South Africa's segregated society, and their unity was its own form of defiance. Despite the serious charges, The trial was riddled with absurdities. One highlight, or lowlight, depending on your perspective, involved the prosecution presenting a map of a purported communist plot. It was more like a child's treasure hunt map, and less like compelling evidence. The trial eventually ended in 1961 with the acquittal of all defendants, proving once again that the apartheid government couldn't even prosecute a kangaroo court properly. While Mandela was juggling his legal battles, his personal life was undergoing its own revolution. In 1958, he married Winnie Madikizela, a social worker with a spirit as fiery as Mandela's own. Winnie would go on to become a formidable figure in the struggle against apartheid in her own right. Their marriage was both a partnership and a symbol of the fight for freedom, a union forged in the crucible of political turmoil. But let's not romanticize too much. Their relationship was far from a fairy tale. Mandela's commitment to the struggle often meant long periods of separation, and the constant pressure of being a political target took its toll. The realities of being married to a revolutionary meant that Winnie often had to play both the supportive partner and the single parent. It was love in the time of apartheid, and it was as complicated as you might imagine. As the 1950s drew to a close, Mandela's life was a whirlwind of activism, legal skirmishes, and personal challenges. He was a man driven by a vision of equality, yet constantly aware of the personal sacrifices that came with it. The decade had seen him rise from a local leader to an international symbol of resistance, a journey marked by courage and camaraderie, but also by moments of isolation and uncertainty. And so, as Mandela prepared to step into the next chapter of his life, the stage was set for an even greater struggle. The seeds of change had been planted, and while the harvest was still years away, the roots were deep and unyielding. The 1950s had been a time of defiance and dreams, of trials both literal and metaphorical. But for Mandela, the journey was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. As the 1950s drew their final curtain, Nelson Mandela was staring down the barrel of a new decade, one that promised more turbulence than a turbulent flight. The 1960s were not just going to be about peace, love, and rock and roll, at least not in South Africa. In 1961, it was time for a strategic pivot that would raise eyebrows, not to mention blood pressure levels in Pretoria. Enter Umkhonto we Sizwe, or Spear of the Nation. Yep, Mandela and his comrades were ready to swap the courtroom drama for a bit of guerrilla theatre. Let's debunk some myths right off the bat. The formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK for those of us who prefer abbreviations, wasn't about Mandela getting a sudden craving for pyrotechnics. This wasn't a case of a non-violent leader suddenly deciding he fancied a bit of armed rebellion for kicks. No, the decision was born out of frustration, born out of a regime that was as open to dialogue as a brick wall. After the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where 69 peaceful protesters were gunned down, Mandela and others realized that the apartheid government was playing a different game, one with rules written in blood. So MK was born. The aim, to sabotage state infrastructure without harming civilians. Think of it as the ultimate in non-lethal protest. Mandela wasn't leading a band of marauding rebels. He was spearheading a strategic effort to make the regime sit up and take notice. The ANC's armed wing was about making noise, literally and metaphorically. But let's not romanticize it too much. These were dangerous times. Mandela and his fellow MK leaders were essentially living double lives. By day, they were respectable members of society. By night, they were clandestine operatives plotting the downfall of a regime. If they were caught, it wouldn't be a slap on the wrist. It would be a one-way trip to the gallows. Now, armed struggle requires armed training, and Mandela wasn't about to take a crash course in guerrilla warfare in his backyard. So, in 1962, he embarked on a secretive grand tour that would make any world traveller envious. Mandela visited Ethiopia, Morocco, and Algeria, training in the art of insurgency. He was like a revolutionary exchange student, learning the ropes from seasoned fighters who had seen their share of conflict. This wasn't a gap year of backpacking and selfies. This was serious business. Mandela's travels weren't just about learning to handle a rifle. They were about building international alliances. He was the face of a movement that needed global support, and foreign governments were starting to take notice. Mandela's charisma and gravitas won him allies, but let's not kid ourselves. The geopolitical chessboard was complicated. Countries were weighing their own interests, and not everyone was ready to jump on the anti-apartheid bandwagon. Back home, the South African government was getting twitchier than a cat on a hot tin roof. Mandela's globetrotting didn't go unnoticed, and the authorities were on high alert. Returning to South Africa in July 1962, Mandela didn't have much time to savor his freedom. Just a month later, he was arrested while posing as a chauffeur, a disguise that didn't quite hold up under scrutiny. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It was a calculated takedown of a man who had become a symbol of resistance. Enter the Rivonia trial, named after the suburb where Mandela and other ANC leaders were captured. If you thought the treason trial was a legal circus, Rivonia was the main event. Charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government, Mandela and his co-defendants faced the death penalty. But Mandela, ever the master of turning adversity into an opportunity, used the trial as a stage. His "I am prepared to die" speech was as much an indictment of apartheid as it was a personal testament. Delivered on April 20, 1964, Mandela's words reverberated far beyond the courtroom walls. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society," he declared, a line that would become as iconic as any in history. It was a speech that didn't just defend him, it defined him. Mandela wasn't just speaking to the judge, he was addressing the world. Let's not romanticize the trial too much. It was a grim spectacle, with the apartheid regime parading its might against a group of men armed only with their convictions. The courtroom was a theater of absurdities, where the prosecution's case often hinged on questionable evidence and dubious logic. Yet Mandela and his fellow accused turned the trial into a platform, illuminating the injustices of apartheid even as they faced its wrath. Outside South Africa, the trial sent shockwaves through the international community. The world was watching, and the apartheid regime was starting to feel the heat. Countries lined up to condemn the proceedings, and Mandela's name became synonymous with the struggle for freedom. But let's not get too carried away. Not every nation was ready to cut ties or impose sanctions. Economic interests were at play, and apartheid-era South Africa was still a valuable trading partner for many. As the trial dragged on, Mandela's fate hung in the balance. On June 12, 1964, the verdict came down: life imprisonment, a sentence that was both a relief and a tragedy. Mandela's journey was far from over, but the next chapter would be written behind bars, on Robben Island, a place that would become as much a part of his story as the man himself. So, as Mandela and his comrades were led away, the world held its breath. The struggle against apartheid was far from over, and Mandela's imprisonment only intensified the global spotlight on South Africa. The 1960s were a decade of seismic shifts, and while Mandela was confined, the movement he had helped ignite was anything but dormant. As the world rallied, the seeds of change continued to grow, nourished by the courage of those who dared to dream of a different future. And so, as the iron gates of Robben Island clanged, shut behind Nelson Mandela, what lay ahead was a new chapter of resilience and quiet rebellion. If you think prison life was all about monochrome uniforms and soul-crushing monotony, you're not entirely wrong. But there's more to it than that, a tale of survival and unexpected camaraderie. Robben Island, located a mere 7 kilometers from the South African coast, might as well have been on another planet. Here, Mandela spent 18 of his 27 years in prison, a number that's staggering just to think about. His days began at 5:30 a.m. with a breakfast of porridge that was more gruel than gourmet. And if you thought that was bad, lunch wasn't much better. It was usually a watery stew that could double as a weight-loss plan. Yet, despite the grim conditions, Mandela found a way to turn his imprisonment into a new arena for activism. The limestone quarry, where he and his fellow inmates labored under the harsh sun, became an unlikely classroom. Mandela, forever the teacher, turned those grueling hours into lessons on politics, history, and philosophy. His fellow prisoners were not just comrades. They were students in what became known as Robben Island University. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find light even in the darkest places. But let's not sugarcoat the reality. Robben Island wasn't a summer camp with some lectures on the side. The conditions were brutal, the guards were often cruel, and the isolation was designed to break spirits. Mandela was allowed one visitor every 6 months and could send and receive just one letter every 6 months. Imagine trying to maintain relationships under those restrictions. It's like the world's most depressing pen-pal system. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the world was changing. The 1970s saw the rise of international pressure against apartheid, with sanctions and boycotts starting to bite. Even the most oblivious world leaders couldn't ignore the moral bankruptcy of apartheid forever. Mandela's name was becoming a global rallying cry, although he was largely unaware of his growing legendary status. For him, each day was a battle against despair, a test of endurance. Inside the prison, Mandela's relationships with fellow inmates were a microcosm of the larger struggle outside. They were a motley crew of activists, each with their own stories of defiance and dreams of freedom. The camaraderie that developed was not just a survival mechanism. It was a testament to the collective spirit of resistance. They shared tales, strategies, and sometimes even humor, a balm against the relentless grind of prison life. Yet the myth of Mandela as a lone hero persisted, even as the reality was one of shared struggle. The truth is, Mandela was never alone in his fight. He was part of a broader movement, a network of individuals who, like him, refused to accept the world as it was. While he was the most visible symbol, the struggle against apartheid was a symphony of voices, each playing their part. Now, let's fast forward to the year 1982, when Mandela was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town. If Robben Island was the end of the world, Pollsmoor was a step up, marginally. It was here, amidst the slightly improved conditions, that Mandela began secret negotiations with the apartheid government. Yep, the man who had become the face of resistance was now talking with the very regime that had imprisoned him. It was a risky move, fraught with potential betrayal and backlash. But Mandela understood something crucial. Dialogue was a tool as powerful as defiance. And then, the moment that had seemed impossible for nearly 3 decades arrived. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free. The world watched as he emerged from Victor Verster prison, hand in hand with Winnie, a smile as wide as the horizon. It was a moment of euphoria, a testament to the power of persistence and hope. But before we get too carried away with the romance of it all, let's remember that Mandela's release was not a magic bullet that ended apartheid overnight. It was just the beginning of yet another chapter. Mandela's first interview post-release was a scene straight out of a sitcom. Picture him, a man who had been away from the world for nearly 3 decades, grappling with the wonders of modern technology. When handed a microphone, Mandela held it upside down, a moment of humility and humor that broke the ice in a world that had changed beyond recognition since his incarceration. But let's not get lost in the charm of it. There was serious work to be done. The economic landscape of South Africa was a mess, with inequality as glaring as a neon sign in a blackout. Mandela knew that political freedom without economic emancipation was just a half measure. So the negotiations began, formal talks to dismantle apartheid and build a new South Africa. It was a marathon, not a sprint, fraught with setbacks, betrayals, and the ever-looming threat of violence. By 1994, the tide had turned, and history was about to be made. On April 27, South Africa held its first multiracial elections, a monumental step towards the vision Mandela had envisioned all those years ago on Robben Island. The result was as expected, a landslide victory for the ANC, and Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first black president of South Africa on May 10, 1994. It was an event that, while triumphant, was the culmination of collective sacrifice and struggle. Yet, the myth of Mandela the Savior overshadowed the truth of a nation's collective effort. While Mandela was undeniably a pivotal figure, the end of apartheid was the result of countless individuals who had fought, suffered, and sacrificed. It was a movement, not a miracle, and Mandela himself was the first to acknowledge that he stood on the shoulders of giants. In his presidency, Mandela faced the Herculean task of reconciling a nation divided by decades of institutionalized racism. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to address past atrocities, a bold move that sought healing through honesty. Mandela's presidency was not without its challenges and criticisms, but it also set the groundwork for a nascent democracy. So, what do we take away from this odyssey of resilience and redemption? That Nelson Mandela was more than a name etched in history. He was a man who embodied the complexities of leadership in turbulent times. His legacy is not just about his imprisonment or presidency, but about the power of unity and the importance of dialogue in the face of division. As we wrap up this tale, remember that history is not just a collection of dates and events. It's the story of real people, their dreams and their struggles. Mandela's life reminds us that while the path to justice is long and fraught with obstacles, the journey is always worth it. And if you ever find yourself overwhelmed by the challenges of today, take a page out of Mandela's book. Find strength in unity, courage in adversity, and always hold the microphone the right way. If you ever wondered what happens when a brilliant mind meets a bit of teenage rebellion, let me introduce you to young Galileo Galilei. Born in 1564 in Pisa, a city not just famous for its leaning tower, but also for leaning into some fascinating history, Galileo was the eldest of 6 siblings. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and a bit of a nonconformist himself, tinkering with the mathematics of music. You could say curiosity ran in the family like a particularly catchy tune. Galileo's early education was a blend of the divine and the practical. He was sent to a monastery school at Vallombrosa, where, instead of focusing on prayers and piety, he reportedly discovered the joys of mathematics. Let's just say that rather than counting his blessings, he was more interested in counting numbers. By 1581, he was back in Pisa, this time at the university, supposedly to study medicine. But Galileo had other ideas. The story goes that during a particularly tedious church service, his attention wandered to a chandelier swinging overhead. Unlike most of us who merely zone out in such situations, Galileo started timing the swings with his pulse. This led to his discovery of isochronism, the principle that pendulums of the same length swing with the same period, no matter the arc size. Now, let's pause for a moment. This story is often romanticized as the birth of modern physics, but the truth is a bit less dramatic. Galileo's actual work on pendulums took years and wasn't fully appreciated until much later. But the image of a young man defiantly timing a swinging chandelier in the middle of Mass is just too good to pass up, right? It's like the original act of teenage defiance. Less about rebellion through loud music, more about quiet contemplation with a dose of scientific inquiry. Speaking of myths, let's talk about that whole apple-dropping experiment. Spoiler alert, it never happened. Galileo didn't climb the Leaning Tower of Pisa to drop spheres of different masses while townsfolk watched in awe. The story was likely a product of a time when people needed clear, vivid examples to explain complex ideas. Think of it as the viral video of the Renaissance. What Galileo did do was more impressive in its own way. He conducted meticulous experiments and used inclined planes to measure the acceleration of objects. His findings: objects accelerate uniformly, regardless of their mass. It was less about spectacle and more about accuracy, though admittedly it doesn't have the same cinematic flair. If Galileo had a spirit animal, it would probably be a magpie, always collecting shiny new ideas, sometimes from unexpected sources. After all, he didn't invent the telescope, as many think. Nope, that was the Dutch. But Galileo took the basic design and cranked it up several notches, improving the magnification from about 3x to 30x. That's like turning a pair of dollar store binoculars into an astronomer's dream. By 1609, he was pointing his enhanced contraption skyward and discovering things that would make even Copernicus gasp. His observations of the moon revealed it was not the smooth, perfect sphere that Aristotle had claimed. Instead, it was a pockmarked, cratered lump of rock. Talk about a moon landing. He spotted 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, which he cheekily named the Medicean stars after his patrons, the Medici family. This little act of naming wasn't just about flattery. It was a strategic move to secure funding and support. Science, like a good game of chess, often involves knowing which pieces to move and when. Galileo's early life and education in Pisa was just the beginning of what would become a lifelong back-and-forth with authority. Whether it was challenging Aristotelian physics or poking holes in divine perfection with his telescope, Galileo seemed to have a knack for ruffling feathers. But this was just the warm-up act. The real fireworks would come later, when his celestial discoveries started to clash with the dogmas of the time. But for now, our young maverick was simply a man with a head full of ideas, a telescope, and a healthy disregard for taking things at face value. Now, Galileo was never one to shy away from a good intellectual brawl. But let's talk about his stint as a university lecturer, where he really started to flex those argumentative muscles. After getting his degree, or rather, not getting it because he left the University of Pisa without finishing, Galileo snagged a teaching gig at the same institution in 1589. Think of it as returning to your old high school to teach, except instead of dealing with hormonal teenagers, he was up against the behemoth of Aristotelian philosophy. It was an academic environment where challenging Aristotle was as welcome as a cat at a dog show. Galileo's lectures were reportedly more controversial than the latest TikTok trends, especially when he challenged the Aristotelian belief that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Imagine telling a room full of scholars that what they'd been teaching for generations was wrong. It was as if he'd walked into a convention of flat-earthers to argue about satellite images. You can bet this didn't win him any popularity contests. In fact, it likely got him more glares than a surprise pop quiz. But Galileo wasn't just about ruffling feathers for the fun of it. Oh no, he had bills to pay. Despite his revolutionary ideas, his salary was a paltry 60 scudi a year, roughly the cost of a decent pair of shoes. And let's be real, even in the 16th century, you couldn't live on foot fashion alone. So, like many academics then and now, he had to hustle. Galileo took on a side gig as a military consultant. Picture this, a brilliant scientist moonlighting as a defense contractor. He advised on fortifications and improved the military compass, a device crucial for artillery aiming. A real Renaissance man of both the arts and the arms. Galileo's knack for invention didn't stop at military gear. He also turned his attention to more peaceful pursuits, inventing a geometric and military compass around 1597. This handy gadget wasn't just for soldiers. It was equally useful for merchants and surveyors. It was like the Swiss army knife of the Renaissance, and selling it became quite the lucrative business. But here's the kicker. Galileo didn't just sell these compasses. He taught exclusive lessons on how to use them, charging extra for the privilege. Talk about a masterclass. Of course, even with these side hustles, money was tighter than a pair of skinny jeans. Galileo found himself in constant disputes over his salary. He eventually moved to the University of Padua in 1592, where he scored a more generous paycheck of 180 scudi. It was hardly a fortune, but considering the Padua job came with a 3-year contract and stability, it was like winning the academic lottery. Plus, Padua was a vibrant intellectual hub, a place where Galileo could mingle with the best and brightest minds of his age, and more importantly, a place where he could continue poking at the status quo. Now, if you think Galileo was content to just teach and tinker, think again. He had a reputation for being as argumentative as a cat with a laser pointer. His students often found him difficult, if not downright infuriating. Galileo's insistence on challenging established ideas made him both a beloved and reviled figure. Colleagues found him abrasive, and more than one faculty meeting likely ended with doors slamming and papers flying. But Galileo had the receipts. His observations and experiments were hard to ignore, even if his personality was a bit much to handle. This brings us to a crucial aspect of Galileo's life. His love for a good argument wasn't just about being right. It was about being heard. In an age where information traveled slower than a snail on a lazy day, Galileo knew the value of self-promotion. He wrote letters, published papers, and cultivated relationships with powerful patrons. The Medici family wasn't just a lucky break, it was a calculated move. Galileo named Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars, not just out of scientific discovery, but as a strategic play for patronage. That's like naming a new species of beetle after a billionaire in hopes they'll fund your research. Even as he juggled teaching, consulting, and inventing, Galileo maintained a restless curiosity and a knack for turning the ordinary into extraordinary. He famously said, "Wine is sunlight, held together by water." And while he was speaking metaphorically, it captures his view of the universe, a place where everyday phenomena could reveal profound truths if you just knew where to look. But as Galileo's fame grew, so did the tension with those around him. His success was a double-edged sword, bringing both admiration and resentment. In the midst of all this, Galileo never lost sight of his primary quest, to understand the universe not as it was taught, but as it truly was. This relentless pursuit of truth, even when it led him into hot water, is what made Galileo not just a product of his time, but a pioneer of the next. So stay tuned, because Galileo's story is about to take another dramatic turn, and trust me, the stars have a lot more to say. As Galileo peered through his telescope, it wasn't just the cosmos that unfolded before him, but a universe of controversy. Here was a man whose head was in the stars, but whose feet were firmly planted in the political minefield of 17th century Italy. Galileo's astronomical observations were as much about navigating celestial bodies as they were about dodging earthly bullets, and the latter were often metaphorical, though no less dangerous. Let's talk about Jupiter, not just a gas giant, but a pivotal player in Galileo's astronomical drama. In 1610, Galileo observed 4 tiny points of light dancing around the planet. These were the Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, though Galileo probably didn't call them by such lyrical names. To him, they were the Medicean stars, a nod to his patrons, the powerful Medici family. Naming rights were a strategic move, akin to slapping sponsor logos on a Formula One car. Galileo was aligning himself with power, because in the cutthroat world of Renaissance academia, support from the Medici was like having a golden ticket in a Willy Wonka factory of political intrigue. This discovery was more than just a triumph of observation. It was a direct challenge to the Ptolemaic system that had dominated astronomy for over a millennium. The idea that everything orbited Earth was about as entrenched as the belief that cheese belongs on pizza. But here was Galileo, holding up a celestial mirror that suggested maybe Earth wasn't the cosmic center after all. Jupiter's moons were a tiny solar system unto themselves, thumbing their noses at geocentric dogma. Now, if you think this ruffled a few feathers, you're right. The Catholic Church, which had enthusiastically adopted the Ptolemaic model because it played nicely with Scripture, was less than thrilled. Galileo's findings came at a time when the Church was about as open to new ideas as a bouncer at an exclusive nightclub. The Reformation had already shaken the institution, and anything hinting at more upheaval was treated like a particularly unwelcome skunk at a garden party. Galileo wasn't just stirring the pot, he was appending the whole kitchen. He published his findings in Sidereus Nuncius, or Starry Messenger, a pamphlet that spread through Europe faster than gossip at a royal court. What he described wasn't just a bunch of dots in the sky, it was a revolution in thought. Galileo's telescope had turned into a megaphone, and the sound it made was Copernican. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Enter Venus, the next piece of the cosmic puzzle. Galileo's observations of Venus's phases, waxing and waning much like the moon, further supported the Copernican model. If Venus was circling the sun, then Earth might not be the center of everything after all. This was a revelation on par with discovering that your favorite celebrity has a secret Twitter account. The implications were huge, but not everyone was ready to retweet. Galileo's support for heliocentrism was like waving a red flag in front of a bull, except the bull was the Catholic Church, and it was less about charging and more about convening committees. The Church was protective of its interpretations of biblical passages, and a sun-centered universe seemed to contradict Scripture. Galileo knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he was also a man who believed in the power of evidence over doctrine. Now here's where the story often gets romanticized. Galileo, the lone hero, defying the Church with a telescope in one hand and a manifesto in the other. But reality is messier. Galileo wasn't alone in his support of Copernican theory. He had allies and detractors in equal measure. It wasn't just him versus the Vatican. It was science versus tradition, a battle fought in university halls, salons, and yes, the occasional church. The political landscape was as fragmented as a dropped mirror. Different factions within the church itself had varying opinions on the Copernican system. Some were open to the idea, seeing it as a potential avenue for reconciling Scripture with observable reality. Others were staunchly opposed, fearing that questioning any part of the established order would lead to a domino effect of doubt. To pin Galileo as a solitary warrior is to ignore the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined this era. Galileo's charm was both his sword and his shield. He was adept at navigating these treacherous waters, cultivating friendships with influential cardinals and scholars. His correspondence was a masterclass in diplomacy, blending wit with wisdom. Yet even he couldn't prevent the tide from turning against him. In 1616, the Church formally declared heliocentrism to be formally heretical, and Copernicus's works were suspended pending correction. Galileo was warned to keep his views under wraps, a bit like telling a rock star to play acoustic in a world that craved electric. But Galileo wasn't one to sit quietly in a corner. He continued his work, albeit more cautiously. In 1632, he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a book structured as a conversation between three characters debating the Ptolemaic and Copernican models. It was a clever way to present his arguments while maintaining a veneer of neutrality, though the Church saw through the disguise as easily as a parent catching a child sneaking cookies. The book was a bestseller, and its success was both a blessing and a curse. Galileo had laid out his case for heliocentrism with the precision of a lawyer and the flair of a playwright. But the Church wasn't laughing. By 1633, Galileo found himself before the Roman Inquisition, accused of heresy. His trial was less about the science and more about authority. The Church was determined to reassert its control, and Galileo was the high-profile target. Now, the popular narrative often paints Galileo as defiant to the last, but the truth is more nuanced. Under threat of torture, he recanted his support for the heliocentric model, reportedly muttering, "And yet it moves," under his breath as he left the courtroom, a quote that's likely apocryphal but too delicious to dismiss entirely. Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a prisoner in his own villa near Florence. Yet even in confinement, he continued to write and experiment, his mind as unchained as ever. His trial was a turning point, not just for Galileo, but for the history of science. It marked the beginning of a slow, arduous shift toward a worldview based on evidence rather than dogma. Galileo wasn't a solitary rebel standing against tyranny. He was a catalyst in a much larger movement, a chapter in the ongoing story of humanity's quest to understand the cosmos. So, was Galileo a hero? In many ways, yes, though not the lone, romanticized figure of myth. He was a man of his time, navigating a landscape as treacherous as the astronomical discoveries he unearthed. His legacy is a testament to the power of curiosity and the courage to follow where evidence leads, even when it leads into the storm. And the storm wasn't over yet. The clouds were gathering for another round, and Galileo, even in his twilight, was ready to face them head-on. Stay tuned, because the universe still had more secrets to reveal, and Galileo was far from finished with his celestial exploration. Galileo's trial was less of a courtroom drama and more of a political theatre, with the Roman Inquisition playing the part of a particularly stern headmaster. Picture a tense board meeting where the main agenda is not just discussing the quarterly losses, but also deciding whether to fire the CEO altogether. The stakes, the authority of the church versus the burgeoning spirit of scientific inquiry. The year was 1633, and Galileo was smack in the middle of the 17th century version of a public relations nightmare. You see, the Inquisition wasn't just some shadowy group of men in robes. It was a powerful institution with its own agenda. The Catholic Church, still smarting from the Protestant Reformation, was in no mood for more dissent. It had spent decades asserting its interpretation of the cosmos, one where Earth was the star of the show. Galileo's heliocentric musings were the equivalent of suggesting the Earth was more of a supporting character. That's akin to telling a diva she's actually the understudy. Galileo, wise to the political climate, tried to play it cool. He showed up with evidence, reasoning, and a dash of charm, hoping to sway the tribunal. But let's face it, he was asking for a miracle. It was like trying to convince a flat Earth society that maybe, just maybe, there's some merit to the whole round planet thing. The Church's portrayal of the cosmos wasn't just doctrine, it was a cornerstone of its authority. Now, here's where the story gets a bit murky. Did Galileo really mutter, "E per se muove"? And yet it moves, under his breath. Probably not. But the myth persists because it's simply too delicious to resist. It's a snappy retort, the kind that makes for great cinema. In reality, Galileo's recantation was more about survival than sass. He was, after all, staring down the barrel of the Inquisition's not-so-metaphorical guns. The punishment, house arrest. But don't let the term fool you. This wasn't your average stay home and binge Netflix scenario. Galileo was confined to his villa in Arcetri, near Florence, a place with more restrictions than the latest iOS update. But at least he wasn't in a dank cell. His imprisonment was cushioned by the comforts of home, albeit with a watchful eye monitoring his every move. Galileo, ever the pragmatist, turned this confinement into an opportunity. He was like a cat that always lands on its feet, even when tossed into a room full of rocking chairs. During his house arrest, he wrote 2 new sciences, a work that would cement his legacy in the annals of physics and engineering. The book focused on the strength of materials and motion, topics that had less to do with celestial bodies and more with the earthly realm. It's worth noting that this wasn't some clandestine operation. Galileo communicated with fellow scientists across Europe through letters, sneaking his manuscripts out like contraband. His ideas spread like wildfire, thanks to a network of friends and allies who were more than happy to play courier. It was the 17th century version of going viral, but with a lot more parchment and ink. Economically, Galileo's situation wasn't as dire as one might expect. Despite the Church's official stance, he still received support from his friends and patrons. The Medici family, who had backed him through thick and thin, didn't abandon ship. Galileo knew the art of patronage, and he played it like a maestro plays a symphony, hitting all the right notes to keep the money and support flowing. In his twilight years, Galileo grappled with the limitations of his physical world. His eyesight began to fail him, a cruel twist for a man whose vision had once extended into the stars. But even as his eyes dimmed, his mind remained sharp as ever. He continued to correspond with thinkers like René Descartes and Marin Mersenne, exchanging ideas that would influence the scientific revolution. And here lies the irony. While Galileo was confined, his ideas roamed free. The Church may have succeeded in silencing his public voice, but it couldn't contain his influence. His work laid the groundwork for future luminaries, like Isaac Newton, who would take Galileo's principles and run with them, turning them into the laws of motion that still hold sway today. In the end, Galileo's story is not just about a brilliant scientist, but about a man who navigated the choppy waters of his time with a mix of cunning and courage. His trial and house arrest were less about silencing a rebel and more about the church trying to hold back the tide of change. Spoiler alert, the tide won. Galileo's legacy is a testament to the power of ideas and the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the church's best efforts, the seeds of scientific thought had been sown, and they would grow into a forest of discovery that no tribunal could ever hope to contain. So, as we leave Galileo in his villa, pen in hand, know this. His story is far from over. The universe still had plenty more to reveal, and Galileo had set the stage for the next act in humanity's quest to understand it. But that's a tale for another day. Stay tuned. In the grand, cosmic tapestry, Galileo's story was a thread that refused to be unraveled, no matter how hard the powers that be tugged at it. Even as he shuffled around his villa, a prisoner of his own genius, his ideas were out there, free-ranging like philosophical livestock grazing in the fertile fields of Europe. And let's be honest, Galileo's intellectual offspring were far more resilient than any papal edict could hope to contain. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, that era of wigs, waistcoats, and wits, when Galileo's legacy was getting the ultimate makeover. This was a time when thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu were throwing shade at tradition with the enthusiasm of a modern Twitter feud. Galileo was put on a pedestal, not just as a maverick scientist, but as a symbol of reason triumphing over dogma. His trial became a cautionary tale of what happens when authority tries to muzzle innovation, an age-old dance between the status quo and those who dare to question it. By the time Newton came around in the late 17th century, Galileo's discoveries had become the foundation stones of modern physics. Newton, that apple-falling, calculus-inventing giant, stood on the shoulders of our Tuscan astronomer, pushing the boundaries of science further than Galileo could have imagined. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, was practically an homage to Galileo's laws of motion. It was like Newton was remixing a classic hit into a chart-topping anthem for the scientific revolution. Even the Catholic Church, the original villain in this drama, couldn't keep up the charade forever. 2 centuries after Galileo's death, Pope Pius VII allowed a more rational re-examination of the heliocentric model. It was a slow climb down from the ivory tower of denial. But in 1992, yes, you heard right, 1992, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the Church's error in condemning Galileo. It was a classic case of better late than never, though at that point it was like apologizing for spilling red wine on someone's white carpet after they'd already redecorated. Galileo's myth, however, wasn't just about cosmic truths. The narrative of the lone genius battling against the establishment has a timeless allure. It's the storyline that makes for great movies and inspirational posters, even if it smooths out the wrinkles of reality. The truth is, Galileo wasn't an isolated hero. He was a man who navigated the social and political landscape with the skill of a chess grandmaster. He was both a product of his time and a pioneer for the ages. Economically, Galileo's story also highlights how science and money have always been strange bedfellows. The reality is that Galileo's discoveries needed patrons, and his alignment with the Medici was as much a financial strategy as it was a scientific one. It's a reminder that behind every great discovery is often a ledger of costs and benefits. This hasn't changed much in the centuries since, whether we're talking about securing grants for particle accelerators or crowdfunding the next big tech innovation. Today, Galileo's tale still resonates in our modern debates about science and authority. Whether it's climate change, vaccinations, or digital privacy, the tension between empirical evidence and entrenched interests is as palpable as ever. Galileo's legacy reminds us that truth isn't something you can vote on or legislate away. It's an ever-evolving puzzle, where every piece matters, even if it doesn't fit neatly into the picture we've been sold. In the end, Galileo's story is less about a solitary man with a telescope and more about the enduring power of curiosity. It's about the courage to look through the lens of skepticism and see the world as it is, not just as we wish it to be. Galileo didn't just leave us with a new map of the heavens. He left us with a roadmap for intellectual bravery. So, as we close the chapter on this remarkable figure, remember that the stars Galileo gazed upon with wonder still twinkle above us, inviting the next generation of thinkers to question, explore, and defy the limits of current understanding. Because if Galileo taught us anything, it's that the universe always has more to reveal, and the discoveries of tomorrow are waiting in the uncharted skies of today. And who knows? The next great revelation might be just a glance through a telescope away.